The morning sun filtered through the narrow gap in the curtains, casting golden stripes across the tidy room. Noah Carter blinked awake, the rays warming his face as he rolled over in bed. The faded photo of his parents, perched carefully on the nightstand, seemed to catch the sunlight just so. Their smiles a silent encouragement as he prepared to face another day. Noah's morning routine was precise and well-practiced. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, feeling the soft creak of the old wooden floor beneath his feet. His grandmother, Mabel, would already be up, humming her familiar gospel songs while she prepared breakfast. The smell of fried eggs and fresh biscuits wafted through the hallway, a comforting reminder of their life together in this small, time-worn house. "Good morning, Gran," Noah called as he entered the kitchen, running a hand over his short-cropped hair. Mabel turned with a wide smile, her face lined with the stories of decades past, eyes bright and full of love. "Good morning, sunshine. Sit down. Eat before it gets cold," she said, motioning to the table where a plate of food waited for him. Despite the weight of her years, she moved with a steady grace that spoke to her years as a nurse, caring for others with tireless devotion. As Noah took his seat, the creak of the old dining chair sounded louder than usual. He glanced at his grandmother, noticing how she subtly wiped her hands on her apron, a gesture she always made when she was deep in thought. "Everything okay, Gran?" Noah asked between bites. "Oh, just thinking about the day ahead," she said, eyes softening. "You've got your shift at Mr. Sanders today, don't you?" "Yes, ma'am. I'll be there all afternoon. Mr. Sanders said the new shipment came in, so it'll be a busy one." Noah's voice carried the mixed tones of anticipation and exhaustion. Work at the local grocery store wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and every hour spent stocking shelves brought him one step closer to his college dream. Mabel's eyes glistened with a mix of pride and concern. "You work so hard, Noah. Just don't forget to give yourself some rest, too." He nodded, appreciating the reminder, but knowing he wouldn't slow down. The scholarship offer from State University had come with relief, but it wouldn't cover everything. Books, rent, food, every dollar he made would help bridge that gap. He took another bite of his breakfast, the familiar taste grounding him as he mentally prepared for the day. After breakfast, Noah cleaned up, grabbed his worn backpack, and headed out the door. The neighborhood was alive with its usual symphony, children laughing as they raced down the cracked sidewalks, car engines rumbling to life, and the distant chatter of neighbors exchanging morning pleasantries. He waved to Mrs. Jenkins, who sat on her front porch in her wicker chair, waving back with a smile that hinted at the stories she loved to share. "Noah, don't forget, you promised to help me with those boxes this weekend," she called out, her voice like the ring of an old bell. "I won't, Mrs. Jenkins," he shouted back with a grin. The path to Sanders' Grocers took him past familiar sights. The corner store with its hand-painted sign, the church with its tall white steeple, and the park where he'd spent countless afternoons playing basketball with friends. Each step was a small reminder of the life he knew so well, a mix of love, resilience, and the quiet struggles everyone shared. Mr. Sanders, the store's gray-haired owner, greeted him with a warm nod as Noah pushed open the glass door. The bell above it tinkled, a nostalgic sound that always reminded Noah of simpler times. "Morning, Noah," Mr. Sanders said, adjusting his glasses. He was already busy unpacking boxes, his movements methodical but slightly strained. "Morning, Mr. Sanders. Looks like we've got our work cut out for us today," Noah replied, taking off his backpack and rolling up his sleeves. The two worked in tandem, their conversation punctuated by the clatter of cans and the rustle of cardboard. It was in these quiet moments, surrounded by the familiar aisles and the faint hum of the store's fluorescent lights, that Noah found a sense of peace. Around midday, the store filled with the soft hum of conversations as customers trickled in. Ms. Rosa Clark, one of the town's most respected figures, came in with a purposeful stride. She was a former teacher who had taught nearly half the town's adults and had a reputation for speaking her mind. "Noah, my dear," she greeted, her voice warm but firm, as she placed a few cans of tomatoes in her basket. I see you're still working hard. Good for you. Thank you, Miss Clark, Noah said, straightening up. It's all for college, you know. Her expression softened, the lines around her mouth easing. You'll do great things, I'm sure of it. Your mother would be proud. The mention of his mother made Noah's chest tighten briefly, but he smiled through it. I hope so, ma'am. The afternoon wore on, filled with the usual routine of stocking shelves, bagging groceries, and exchanging friendly words with the regulars. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting warm amber hues through the store's front windows, Noah felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settle in. But beneath that was something more powerful. Hope. The hope that each day's effort was building a future his parents would have wanted for him. When his shift finally ended, Noah gathered his things, waved goodbye to Mr. Sanders, and stepped out into the evening air. The sky was awash with streaks of orange and pink, the kind of sunset that seemed to paint the world in fleeting beauty. He breathed it in, feeling the coolness of the coming night seep into his skin. The walk home was peaceful, the rhythmic crunch of gravel underfoot a comforting sound. Each step reminded him of why he pushed so hard. Every moment was a tribute to those who had come before him, those who believed he could reach beyond what life had handed him. As Noah turned the corner onto his street, the familiar sight of his grandmother's house came into view, porch light glowing like a beacon. The thought of her waiting, probably with a cup of sweet tea, and her unwavering smile, quickened his steps. No matter how long the day had been, home always held a warmth that nothing else could match. Noah awoke the next morning with a sense of lingering fatigue but pushed it aside. It was another day, another chance to edge closer to his goal. The sun had barely stretched its rays across the sky, painting the horizon with soft pastels, when Noah set off to run errands before heading to work. He'd promised Mrs. Jenkins he'd help move some boxes, and while his schedule was already tight, he kept his promises. The neighborhood was quieter than usual. A morning hush settled over the rows of small houses. As he made his way to Mrs. Jenkins' home, he took in the sight of dew-kissed grass and the scent of freshly baked bread from the bakery down the street. The peace was something Noah held on to. It was the backdrop of his life, fragile but cherished. Mrs. Jenkins greeted him with an exaggerated sigh of relief when he knocked on her door. "Oh, Noah, you're a lifesaver, truly. These boxes might as well be filled with bricks," she said, waving him into the living room that smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. "It's no trouble at all, Mrs. Jenkins," Noah replied, offering his signature easy smile. He hoisted the first box, heavier than expected, but manageable. They chatted as he moved the boxes to her storage room, her stories of years gone by filling the quiet space. After finishing, Noah glanced at the clock. He was cutting it close if he wanted to make it to work on time, but he reassured her with a quick wave. "I'll see you soon, Mrs. Jenkins." "Take care, Noah. Don't overwork yourself, you hear?" she called after him, the concern in her voice a reminder of the bond she shared with the entire neighborhood. The day unfolded like most others, a series of small moments woven into a rhythm that, though predictable, gave Noah a sense of control. But as evening approached, that feeling began to waver. With his shift at Sanders' grocer's over, Noah collected his things and exchanged a wave with Mr. Sanders, who was still finishing up paperwork at the front desk. The older man's brows furrowed as he watched Noah go, the concern almost imperceptible but there nonetheless. The sun dipped below the horizon, its orange glow fading into dusk, as Noah climbed into the driver's seat of his late mother's old Toyota Corolla. The familiar hum of the engine, steady but tired, settled him. He adjusted his rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the street stretching behind him. The road home wasn't long, but tonight an inexplicable tension crept into the quiet. The streets were dimly lit, the glow of street lamps casting long shadows. As Noah took a turn onto Arlington Avenue, the flashing blue and red lights appeared suddenly in his rearview mirror, slicing through the darkness like a siren's wail. Noah's heart stuttered, a momentary jolt that steadied only when he reminded himself of what his mother used to say. "Stay calm, be respectful, and keep your hands where they can see them." He exhaled slowly, pulling over to the side and cutting the engine. His hands found their place on the steering wheel, fingers spread wide. The cruiser door slammed behind Officer Harrison, a figure familiar in town for reasons nobody liked to discuss openly. His heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed as he approached Noah's window. The flashlight beamed directly into Noah's eyes, sharp and invasive despite the faint glow of twilight. "License and registration," came the barked command, devoid of introduction or explanation. "Yes, sir," Noah replied, his voice even. He moved slowly, announcing each motion as he reached for his wallet. "I'm getting my license now, sir." The officer's face, illuminated briefly by the streetlight, was stern, eyes narrowed and jaw set. The silence thickened as Noah handed over his papers, waiting for whatever would come next. "You know why I pulled you over?" Officer Harrison asked, his voice low but charged. "No, sir," Noah said, holding the officer's gaze for just a moment before averting his eyes, showing respect as his grandmother had taught him. "Was I speeding?" A smirk pulled at the corner of Harrison's mouth. "You rolled through a stop sign back there. Don't play dumb, son." Noah's heart sank. He knew he had made a full stop, but contradicting the officer wouldn't change anything. He chose his words carefully. "I'm sorry if I made a mistake, sir." Harrison's eyes flickered with something Noah couldn't quite place. "Step out of the car." "Sir?" Noah's voice wavered despite himself. The air between them turned electric, a taut silence before Harrison's eyes hardened further. "Out!" the officer snapped, one hand resting on the handle of his baton. Noah complied, the sudden coolness of the night brushing against his skin as he stood next to his car. The faint rumble of a passing vehicle slowed as it neared, its occupants staring with wide eyes at the scene unfolding. "Spread your legs. Hands on the hood," Harrison ordered, his tone carrying the weight of authority sharpened by something darker. Noah swallowed, the burn of humiliation crawling up his neck as he did as he was told. The metal of the car was cold beneath his palms, a stark contrast to the heat building in his chest. A rough pat-down followed, the officer's movements more forceful than necessary. Noah winced but held his ground, the quiet on the street pressing down like a weight. The flashlight's beam moved erratically as Harrison searched the inside of Noah's car without permission, overturning the glove compartment and shifting the seats. After what felt like an eternity, the officer stepped back, his jaw clenched as he muttered, "Nothing here." Noah turned his head slightly, daring to ask, "May I go now, sir?" Harrison's expression twisted into something between a sneer and a smirk. He dangled Noah's keys in front of him, just out of reach. "I'll be watching you. Don't think for a second that this is over." With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the keys into the grass by the roadside, the metallic clink echoing in the night. Noah's heart pounded as he stooped to retrieve them, the officer's stare burning into his back. The sound of another car slowing nearby pulled their attention. The window rolled down and Ms. Rosa Clark's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Noah Carter, what on earth is going on here?" Her eyes flashed with the kind of authority that only years of teaching and advocacy could bring. Noah's shoulders sagged, relief mingling with the frustration still simmering beneath the surface. "Ms. Clark, Get in my car now," she interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. The officer's posture stiffened, but he said nothing as Noah stepped away, his keys clutched tightly in his fist. The warmth of her car was a stark contrast to the chill outside. As Noah buckled himself in, Miss Clark turned to him, eyes filled with concern and a question she didn't need to voice. He took a breath, the story tumbling out as the night deepened around them. When he finished, Miss Clark's expression was set, lines of determination etched into her face. "This won't stand," she said, more to herself than to him. The car made a sharp U-turn, heading back toward town, as she reached for her phone, fingers flying over the screen. By the time Noah reached his grandmother's house, the exhaustion he felt wasn't just physical. He stepped into the familiar warmth, the faint scent of peach cobbler from the kitchen, barely touching his senses. Mabel was in her chair, a worried crease between her brows as she met his eyes. "What happened, Noah?" she asked, voice steady but low. He sank into the couch, the events of the night unraveling in his mind. "Gran," he said, meeting her gaze with a weariness that spoke volumes. Something's got to change. The night's events replayed in Noah's mind like a broken record as he lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. The weight of the encounter with Officer Harrison pressed down on him, seeping into his bones. Every detail etched into his memory. The sharp command, the cold metal of the car hood, the way passing drivers had stared at him as if he were guilty of something more than simply existing. He turned his head to the side, the faint glow of his grandmother's porch light filtering in through the curtains. It was a reminder of safety, the soft illumination casting long shadows across the room. But tonight, even that small comfort felt diminished. The next morning, Noah woke to the sound of his grandmother's gentle knock on his door. "Noah, breakfast is ready," Mabel said, her voice carrying its usual warmth, tinged now with an undercurrent of worry. "Coming, Gran," Noah replied, pushing himself up. He glanced at the mirror, noting the shadows under his eyes, a reflection of the restless night he'd endured. Mabel was setting the table when he walked into the kitchen. A plate of scrambled eggs and toast sat waiting for him. She looked up, her expression softening as their eyes met. "You didn't sleep much," she said, not asking but knowing. Noah shook his head, taking a seat. The clatter of his fork against the plate was the only sound for a moment. "I keep thinking about last night," he admitted finally, pushing the eggs around absently. How easily it could have gone worse. Mabel reached out, her fingers warm as they closed over his hand. "It's not right, Noah," she said softly, "and it's not something we can ignore anymore." Noah nodded, a heaviness in his chest loosening at the touch of her hand. The memory of Ms. Rosa Clark's resolute expression surfaced, reminding him that he wasn't alone in this. There was power in numbers, in the voices of those who believed in justice and fairness. A knock at the front door broke the moment. Mabel's brow furrowed slightly as she stood, wiping her hands on her apron. The morning air rushed in as she opened the door, revealing Mrs. Clark herself, standing tall and formidable despite her small frame. "Good morning, Mabel, Noah," she greeted, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The determination in her eyes was palpable. "We need to talk." Noah straightened in his chair, his heart picking up speed. Mabel motioned for her to sit, but Ms. Clark waved it off, too energized for small comforts. "I've already spoken to several people this morning," she began, her voice steady. "And it turns out that your experience with Officer Harrison is not isolated. Others have come forward. Young men and women, some older folks too, all with stories of encounters that went too far." A chill ran down Noah's spine, anger sparking in the pit of his stomach. "Why hasn't anything been done before now?" he asked, though he knew the answer. "Fear mainly," Mrs. Clark said, eyes softening as she looked at him. "But last night changed something. People are talking now, Noah. Your story is lighting a fire under this community, and we need to keep it burning." Mabel crossed her arms, nodding slowly. "What can we do, Rosa?" "We're organizing a meeting at the community center," Mrs. Clark said. "We'll share what we know, gather more testimonies, and discuss a plan. I want you there, Noah. Your voice matters." The thought of standing in front of a room full of people made Noah's throat tighten. He had never been one for the spotlight, preferring the quiet reliability of the grocery store aisles. But he knew this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been mistreated and stayed silent out of fear. "I'll be there," he said, the words carrying more weight than he expected. "Ms. Clark smiled, the hard line of her mouth softening for the first time. "Good. We'll show them that change is long overdue." The community center buzzed with anticipation that evening. Folding chairs lined the room, quickly filling with familiar faces. There was Mr. Sanders, still in his store apron, sitting with a solemn look. Mrs. Jenkins had come too, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Teenagers clustered near the back, whispering and casting anxious glances at the adults. Even some local business owners and clergy members attended, lending an air of gravity to the gathering. Noah sat near the front with Mabel beside him. The room felt heavy with shared frustration and a simmering need for action. Ms. Clark stood at the center, clipboard in hand, eyes sweeping across the crowd before she began to speak. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice loud and sure, instantly commanding attention. "We're here tonight because what happened to Noah Carter should never happen to anyone in this town. Yet it has." Over and over, murmurs rippled through the crowd, and heads nodded in agreement. Noah felt the collective gaze of the room press on him, the weight of expectation mixed with empathy. It was strange and comforting at the same time. "We need to hear your stories," Miss Clark continued. "If we're going to hold Officer Harrison accountable, we need more than just one voice. We need a chorus that can't be ignored." One by one, people stood and spoke. Some were brief, recounting incidents with clipped words and tense shoulders, as if even now the memories threatened to choke them. Others spoke longer, their voices quivering but unwavering, recounting moments when they had been pulled over, searched, or harassed without cause. The stories shared common threads of humiliation, fear, and injustice. Noah felt a growing anger twist in his gut as each testimony added to the pile of evidence. But it wasn't just anger, it was resolve. When it was Noah's turn, he stood, feeling the heat of dozens of eyes on him. His grandmother gave his hand a reassuring squeeze before he stepped forward. He took a breath, the silence in the room palpable. "Last night, I was pulled over by Officer Harrison," he began, his voice steady despite the thudding of his heart. "He said I didn't stop at a sign, but I know I did. He searched my car without permission and treated me like I was guilty of something. Of what? I still don't know." A murmur swept through the room, but Noah kept going. "I'm not the only one. We all know that. But tonight, we're saying it out loud. We're not staying quiet anymore." The applause that followed was immediate, swelling and powerful. It was a sound Noah had never expected, but felt deeply. "Ms. Clark placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes glistening with pride. "Thank you, Noah," she said, turning to the room. "Now we take the next steps. We gather signatures, demand body camera footage, and press for an official investigation. It's time they know we won't let this go." The rest of the meeting buzzed with plans and ideas. Committees were formed, volunteers listed their contact information, and a petition was drafted on the spot. By the time the meeting ended, Noah felt as if he had stepped into a new world, one where silence was no longer an option. The following days were a blur of activity. Noah found himself juggling shifts at the grocery store with meetings at Mrs. Clark's house, where a small group gathered to coordinate their efforts. Calls were made to local news outlets, friends reached out to friends, and soon the town's attention was fully fixed on the issue at hand. Mabel watched with quiet pride as Noah spoke to reporters outside the community center one evening. His voice, once hesitant and unsure, now carried a new strength. "We're not just fighting for me," he told them. "We're fighting for fairness for everyone in this town." The media coverage stirred responses from neighboring towns and community leaders. Articles appeared in the local newspaper, recounting the meeting and sharing testimonies from those who had attended. Each headline amplified the growing momentum, shining a light on Officer Harrison's pattern of behavior. One evening, as Noah sat in his room, scrolling through supportive comments and reading messages from strangers who shared similar stories, he felt the tight knot of anxiety begin to loosen. They were being heard. For the first time, the possibility of real change felt within reach. But with attention came backlash. Anonymous calls to the house, whispers in the grocery aisles, and pointed glances from those who supported Harrison or feared the upheaval of the status quo. Noah's skin prickled with each sign of resistance, but Mabel's quiet reassurance steadied him. "They're loud because they're afraid," she said one evening, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. "But fear doesn't last as long as truth." "Ms. Clark called one afternoon, her voice charged with excitement. "The police department has agreed to a preliminary review. They've been flooded with requests for transparency. It's a start." Noah exhaled, the sound of it shivering with hope. It was a small step, but it was progress, and that was more than he dared to dream of just days before. The sun cast a pale, diffused glow through the windows of the community center as Noah entered, feeling the sharp pinch of anticipation in his chest. It was a space that had always felt familiar, filled with echoes of town hall meetings, church gatherings, and school events. But today, it pulsed with a different kind of energy, charged, uncertain, and raw. The preliminary review announcement had set the town abuzz. It was a signal that their voices were being heard, but with it came division. Supporters of Noah and those demanding accountability for Officer Harrison found themselves pitted against those who believed that challenging the status quo would destabilize the community they'd built. It was a tension that played out in grocery store aisles, in whispers at church, and, tonight, here in the community center. Noah scanned the room as it filled, noticing familiar faces: Mr. Sanders, who stood by the doorway with his arms crossed; Mrs. Rosa Clark, clipboard in hand, talking in urgent whispers with Pastor Walker, who had come to show support; and Mrs. Jenkins, her lips pursed tightly as if holding back words. On the far side of the room, a group of men stood together, their eyes narrowed and their expressions stony. Noah's grandmother, Mabel, touched his arm gently, drawing his attention. "Don't let their looks get to you," she said, reading the tension in his shoulders. Her voice was calm, but he could see the shadow of worry in her eyes. "I won't," Noah said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his nerves. He took a deep breath, the scent of lemon polish and old wood grounding him as he moved to the front with Mrs. Clark. The room quieted when she stepped forward. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice slicing through the murmur like a gavel. "We are here tonight to discuss next steps and to hear from those who haven't yet had their chance to speak." A hand shot up from the crowd, and James Wilkins, a former police officer who had retired years ago, stood up. His grizzled features softened as he looked around the room. "I've seen both sides of this," he said, voice heavy with age and experience. "I know how fear can twist good intentions, how power can change people. But I also know that not every officer uses their badge the way they should." The room held its breath, waiting for him to continue. James's eyes landed on Noah, and he nodded once, a silent show of support. Before anyone else could speak, a scoff came from the back. Eric Turner, one of the men who had been watching with crossed arms, stepped forward. His posture was rigid, eyes sharp and accusing. "What's happening here is dangerous," he said. "We're tearing apart our town for the sake of one kid's bad run-in." A few murmurs of agreement rumbled through the room, but they were met with glares and shushes. Noah felt the heat rise in his cheeks. He clenched his fists at his sides, feeling Mabel's hand tighten on his arm as a silent reminder to stay calm. "Ms. Clark raised her hand, silencing the room again. "Eric, we're not here to divide this town. We're here to ensure fairness and justice for everyone. This isn't just about Noah," she said, her voice firm but patient. "It's about years of stories just like his, swept under the rug." Pastor Walker cleared his throat, stepping up beside Mrs. Clark. "Let's not forget why we're here," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "We're not here to pick sides, but to find truth and bring healing. Without that, we're leaving wounds open." The tension in the room seemed to ebb slightly, the pastor's words weaving a thin thread of unity through the space. Noah finally found his voice. "I didn't want any of this attention," he began, scanning the crowd for familiar, friendly faces to anchor him. "I just wanted to get home that night, like any of you would. But what happened showed me that staying quiet isn't the answer. If speaking up can stop this from happening to anyone else, then that's what I have to do." The silence that followed was heavy. Then, slowly, a round of clapping started, first from Mrs. Jenkins, who looked proud despite the worry lines on her face. It spread like a wave, sweeping through most of the room, though Eric and a few others remained stiff and unmoving. The following days were marked by a flurry of activity. Noah found himself fielding calls and messages from people he'd never met, some offering support, others voicing doubts or outright hostility. He kept himself busy helping Mrs. Clark compile testimonies, digging through old police reports, and reaching out to those who had yet to share their stories. One afternoon, as he sat at the kitchen table with Mabel, phone buzzing every few minutes, A knock came at the door. Mabel's brows rose slightly as she set down her tea and stood to answer it. Noah heard low voices, and then the scrape of the chair as Mabel came back, her expression tense. "It's Officer Daniels," she said quietly. "He wants to speak with you." Noah's stomach twisted. Officer Daniels was one of the younger officers, known for his calm demeanor and reluctance to engage in the town's more controversial matters. Steeling himself, Noah stood and walked to the door. Daniels shifted uncomfortably on the porch, eyes darting around as if expecting to be watched. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low. Noah nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. The air inside felt charged, each creak of the floorboards amplified by the silence that followed. "I won't stay long," Daniels said, glancing briefly at Mabel, who stood with her arms crossed and eyes wary. "I just wanted to say that not all of us are like Harrison. Some of us joined this job to do good, to protect and serve, like we're supposed to." Noah's jaw clenched. "Then why has it taken this long for anyone to say anything?" The question came out sharper than he intended, but he didn't regret it. Daniels looked down, the weight of the unspoken pressing on his shoulders. "Because saying something isn't as simple as it should be," he said after a moment. "But I'm here now. I can't speak for everyone, but I'll help in any way I can to see that this is done right." Mabel's expression softened slightly. "It's a start," she said, a note of hope threading through her voice. Daniels nodded once, a slight smile pulling at the corners of his mouth before he turned and left, leaving the door ajar as if to let in a breeze of new possibility. The preliminary review moved quickly under mounting pressure. Reports were submitted, witnesses questioned, and community voices rang out, filling every corner of the town with the hum of anticipation. One evening, Ms. Clark called a meeting at her house to update those involved. Noah arrived to find the small living room packed with people, the air buzzing with whispered conversations. Pastor Walker and Mr. Sanders were there, along with others who had spoken out at the initial meeting. Even some new faces appeared, people who had once stayed silent but now stood with expressions of guarded hope. Ms. Clark stood at the center, a stack of papers in her hand. "I just came from the station," she said, her voice strong. "They're reviewing footage and have started interviewing officers. This isn't over, but we're being heard." A murmur swept through the room, a mix of relief and tension. Noah looked around, catching Jamal, one of his closest friends, in the crowd. Jamal offered a quick nod, his eyes saying what words didn't need to. "Keep going." Pastor Walker stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the room. "We have to stay vigilant," he said. "No matter the outcome, what we're doing here matters. This town is changing because we're willing to face the hard truths." Someone in the back, a young woman named Tasha, raised her hand. "What if they don't find enough evidence? What if it just gets brushed aside like before?" The question hung in the air, casting a shadow over the moment. Noah felt the weight of it settle in his chest. He met Ms. Clark's eyes, searching for the reassurance that had carried him this far. "If that happens," Mrs. Clark said, pausing for emphasis, "we don't stop. We keep pushing, because justice doesn't come to those who wait. It comes to those who demand it." The room fell silent, the gravity of her words sinking in. And in that silence, Noah realized that what they had started was bigger than one meeting, one review, or even one outcome. It was the beginning of something that would echo far beyond the walls of the community center, or Mrs. Clark's crowded living room. As he left that night, the cool air brushing against his face, Noah felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The road ahead was uncertain, but he could see it now, stretching before him and lined with people who, like him, refused to stand in the shadows any longer. A restless wind swept through the streets of Rose Hill, tugging at leaves and sending them skittering along the cracked sidewalks. The town felt different, tense, like it was holding its breath. Every conversation seemed charged, each glance longer and more meaningful than before. As Noah walked the short distance to Sanders' Grocers, he could feel eyes on him, a mix of curiosity, respect, and disapproval. The store was quieter than usual when he stepped inside, the familiar ding of the door chime sounding almost intrusive. "Mr.?" Sanders looked up from behind the counter, his mouth set in a thin line. He gave Noah a nod that spoke volumes. Solidarity, weariness, and a quiet warning all wrapped into one. "Noah," he said, running a hand over his balding head. "You holding up, son?" "I'm fine, Mr. Sanders," Noah replied, though the tension in his shoulders said otherwise. "Mr. Sanders opened his mouth as if to say something more, but closed it again, nodding once before returning to his work. Noah moved to the back to restock shelves, the silence pressing in on him. As he worked, snippets of conversation floated in from the front. "Oh, they say Officer Harrison might be suspended," one voice murmured. "Good riddance if he is," another countered, this one sharper, almost defensive. Noah couldn't help but pause, his hands frozen on a box of cereal. Every word seemed amplified, echoing in the empty aisles. He felt the pressure of being at the center of a storm that had been gathering strength for years. The tension spilled over that evening when Pastor Walker called an impromptu meeting at the church. The space, usually filled with the sound of gospel songs and shared laughter, was a cacophony of voices, some angry, others pleading for calm. Noah sat near the front, Mabel at his side, her eyes fixed on the rows of people packed into the pews. Even the balcony was full, every face etched with concern. The murmurs quieted as Pastor Walker took his place at the pulpit. He raised his hands, palms out, a silent plea for order. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying a deep resonance that commanded attention. "We are at a crossroads. What happens next depends on how we choose to move forward." A man near the back, Tom Hastings, stood abruptly, drawing eyes to him. Tom was known for his staunch support of law enforcement, having served as a reserve officer in his younger years. "And what if moving forward tears this town apart?" he demanded. "You're asking people to choose sides, Pastor. What about those of us who don't want to see our community divided?" A ripple of agreement swept through a section of the crowd. Mabel's eyes narrowed, but she stayed silent, her fingers laced tightly in her lap. "No one here wants division, Tom," Pastor Walker said, leaning forward slightly. "But if we don't address these wrongs, we're only pretending at peace. True unity comes from justice, not silence." Noah's chest tightened. He knew that moments like these could define the course of their fight. A single word or reaction could tilt public opinion one way or the other. He felt the collective weight of expectation settle on him, and for a moment he wanted nothing more than to disappear into the back of the room. Then, to his surprise, Jamal, who had been sitting quietly by the window, stood up. "If staying quiet is what keeps peace, then that peace isn't worth having," he said, his voice clear and strong. "We all know someone who's been mistreated. We've just been too scared to admit it." Heads turned, and for the first time that night, a different energy filled the room. People whispered to each other, nodding in agreement, or exchanging looks that said, "I know, I've been there." Tom's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak again. The pastor took a breath, scanning the room as the voices settled. "The truth has a way of making people uncomfortable," he said, "but discomfort is where growth begins." Over the next few days, the investigation gained momentum. Officer Harrison was placed on administrative leave pending the review, a move that sent shockwaves through the town. For some, it was a sign that justice was finally being pursued. For others, it felt like a betrayal, a crack in the foundation of their belief in the system. Noah found himself caught between hope and dread. Every trip to the store or walk through the neighborhood brought whispers and sidelong glances. Supportive nods came from some, while others crossed the street when they saw him approaching. One afternoon, as he helped Mabel water the small garden in their yard, a car slowed in front of their house. The window rolled down, revealing Eric Turner, his expression hard. "You think you're doing something good, don't you?" he called, voice laced with bitterness. "All you're doing is tearing this town apart." Noah felt Mabel's hand rest lightly on his back, her silent support as steady as the soil beneath their feet. He met Eric's eyes, refusing to flinch. If it takes tearing things apart to build them back right, then that's what I'll do." Eric muttered something under his breath and drove off, leaving the air heavy with unspoken tension. Mabel sighed, looking at her grandson with a mixture of pride and worry. "The closer you get to the truth, the louder the opposition," she said softly. The next big step came when Ms. Clark called Noah to her house. He arrived to find the small living room filled with more people than he'd expected. Jamal, Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Sanders, and others who had become key figures in their movement. Ms. Clark stood at the center, papers spread across her dining table, the pages fluttering slightly as the breeze from an open window swept through the room. "Everyone, we have some news," she began, the room falling silent as her voice cut through the chatter. "The review board has agreed to release partial footage from the night Noah was pulled over." A murmur ran through the crowd. Noah's pulse quickened, anticipation sparking like electricity under his skin. "They're going to show it at the community center tomorrow evening, but only to a select group. Those involved in the investigation and a few community representatives," Mrs. Clark continued. "We need to be there." The next day, Noah sat at the long wooden table in the community center, surrounded by familiar faces. Mrs. Clark, Pastor Walker, Mabel, and others who had supported him from the start. Across the room, Officer Daniels sat stiffly, his uniform a reminder of the authority he both represented and questioned. To his left, the town's police chief, Chief Rollins, had a look of grim resolve. A projector hummed softly, the sound filling the tense silence as the lights dimmed. The footage began, grainy at first. The angle from Officer Harrison's chest-mounted body camera, capturing flashes of headlights and the outline of Noah's car. "License and registration," Harrison's voice barked through the speakers, the same cold command that had echoed in Noah's memory countless times. The room watched as the scene played out. The harsh flashlight beam, the rough pat-down, the search of Noah's car without consent. Noah felt every second drag, each moment heavier than the last. When the video ended, the silence was suffocating. Ms. Clark was the first to break it. "This isn't just a mistake," she said, voice steady but fierce. "It's a pattern. We know it, and now we see it." Chief Rollins leaned forward, his eyes shifting between Noah and Mrs. Clark. "The review isn't over," he said, voice low. "But I can tell you this. Actions will be taken." Outside, as the group stepped into the cool evening air, the buzz of conversation filled the space around them. Noah stood still for a moment, taking it all in. For the first time, the night sky above didn't seem so heavy. In the days that followed, word spread. People who hadn't paid attention before were now listening. Even those who had been unsure started to reconsider their stance. Eric Turner's disapproving glares remained, but they felt less threatening now, drowned out by the murmurs of change that swept through the town. But with progress came pushback. An anonymous note slipped under their door read, "Stay quiet or face the consequences." Mabel's face tightened when she found it, but she didn't show Noah right away. Instead, she tucked it away and set her jaw in that way she did when she was determined to protect him no matter what. The night of the next community meeting, Noah stood at the podium in the center of the room, his hands gripping the edges as he scanned the faces before him. Supporters sat near the front, their eyes bright with hope. Others sat further back, arms crossed, expressions guarded. "I never wanted to be here, standing in front of all of you," Noah began, his voice steady but edged with emotion. "But silence only protects the status quo. And that's not good enough. Not for me, not for any of us." Applause erupted, hesitant at first, but growing until it filled the room. Eric Turner's eyes narrowed, but he didn't move or speak. The tide was shifting, and even he could feel it. As Noah stepped back from the podium, Mabel reached up and touched his arm, her eyes glistening. "You did good, Noah," she whispered. "Real good." The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt winnable. The cracks in the town's facade were widening, letting light in where there had only been shadows. And Noah, once afraid to be seen, now stood at the center, unyielding. The crisp morning air carried the scent of damp earth, and the distant sound of barking dogs as Noah sat on the front steps of his grandmother's house. The town was quieter than usual, a collective pause after the events of the past weeks. The community meeting had sent shockwaves through Rose Hill, rippling out in tense conversations in living rooms, whispers behind counters, and heated debates in parking lots. Mabel emerged from the house, a steaming mug of chamomile tea in her hands. She settled down next to Noah, the soft rustle of her apron brushing against his arm. For a moment, they sat in silence, watching the shadows of branches dance across the sidewalk as the morning sun stretched its golden fingers across the neighborhood. "Big day today," Mabel said finally, breaking the quiet. Her voice was steady, but there was a subtle tension in it, like a string pulled just a bit too tight. "Yeah," Noah replied, turning the mug in his hands without drinking. The review board was set to make a preliminary statement about Officer Harrison and the investigation later that afternoon. The anticipation gnawed at him, fraying the edges of his resolve. Mabel reached over, placing a warm hand on his knee. "No matter what happens today, you've already done so much, Noah. More than most people would have the courage to do." He met her eyes, a small, grateful smile playing on his lips. "I know, Gran, but it doesn't feel like enough. Not yet." The sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled their attention to the street. A blue sedan slowed to a stop in front of their house, and Mrs. Rosa Clark stepped out, her expression serious but kind. She waved as she approached, and Noah stood to meet her. "Morning, Mabel." "Noah," she greeted, nodding at both of them. "Mind if I come up for a moment?" "Of course, Rosa," Mabel said, shifting to make room on the step. "Ms.?" Clark sat down with a sigh, the lines around her eyes deepening as she glanced between them. "I just came from the mayor's office," she said, her voice low. "They're feeling the pressure, Noah. Not just from us, but from people who've started calling from neighboring towns, even some reporters from the city." Noah's heart thumped harder. The idea that their fight had reached beyond the borders of Rose Hill both thrilled and terrified him. "Does that mean they're taking this seriously?" he asked. "Ms.?" Clark's eyes softened as she nodded. "More than they'd like to admit. But don't get too hopeful just yet. This is where things can get tricky. When the stakes are high, people show who they really are." The hours leading up to the review board's announcement were a blur of anxious energy. The town hall was bustling with people, the tension so thick it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Noah stood with Ms. Clark, Pastor Walker, and Mabel near the back, the air around them buzzing with nervous conversation. Officer Daniels entered the room, giving Noah a small nod before taking a seat near the front. It was a silent acknowledgement, a fragile thread of alliance. Noah took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of Mabel's presence beside him. The murmurs quieted as Chief Rollins stepped up to the podium, his uniform crisp and his expression unreadable. He adjusted the microphone, the small movement drawing every eye to him. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice measured and professional. "As many of you know, the past few weeks have brought to light allegations against Officer Harrison that required thorough examination. Today, I am here to provide an update on our findings so far." Noah's hands clenched at his sides, the room seeming to shrink around him as he waited for the next words. "After reviewing body camera footage, testimonies, and official complaints, we have determined that Officer Harrison's actions on the night in question were in violation of department policy. Effective immediately, Officer Harrison has been placed on unpaid suspension pending further investigation." A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by a murmur of voices, some relieved, others angry. Noah's heart surged, hope sparking in the depths of his chest. It wasn't a definitive end, but it was more than he dared to hope for. Chief Rollins raised a hand for quiet. "I want to be clear. This is not the end of the process. We are committed to a comprehensive review of any and all related cases. Our goal is to ensure that our community can trust those tasked with protecting it." Noah glanced at Mrs. Clark, whose eyes shone with quiet triumph. Pastor Walker offered a solemn nod, and Mabel squeezed Noah's arm, her grip steady and strong. But amidst the claps and whispered discussions, Noah caught sight of Eric Turner in the corner. His jaw clenched, eyes narrowed. The look in his eyes was dark, a storm brewing on the horizon. The suspension of Officer Harrison did more than just spark conversations, it ignited a blaze. Within days, the town became a battleground for heated debates. Supporters of Noah's fight for justice stood firm, rallying for more transparency and deeper investigations. On the other side were those who felt threatened by the changes, viewing the suspension as an affront to the trust they'd placed in law enforcement. The tension became palpable, spilling into the day-to-day. Noah saw it at Sanders' Grocers, where regular customers either offered quiet words of encouragement or refused to meet his eyes. One afternoon, while stocking shelves, he overheard two men arguing near the produce section. "This whole thing is going to ruin our town," one said, voice tight with anger. "We need order, not chaos." The other, an older man who Noah recognized as Mr. Alvarez, shook his head. "Order doesn't mean ignoring the truth. If there's a problem, we fix it. That's how we keep trust." Noah's hands paused mid-movement, the words settling into him. It was a reminder that while change was messy, it was necessary. He carried that thought home, where Mabel waited with her warm smile and quiet strength. That evening, as Noah walked to Mrs. Clark's house for another planning meeting, he noticed the street felt different. There were fewer people out, and those who were kept their distance. A shadow seemed to stretch over Rose Hill, the anticipation of what was to come heavy in the air. The planning meeting was already in full swing when Noah arrived. Jamal sat on the arm of a chair, his fingers tapping a restless beat. Mrs. Jenkins pored over a list of names, nodding to herself. "Ms.?" Clark stood at the head of the room, her presence commanding but calm. "We need to be prepared for the backlash," she said, her eyes meeting each person's in turn. "There are people who don't want change, who see this as a threat to their way of life." Pastor Walker stepped forward, folding his hands. "And those people will push back hard. We need to stay unified, keep our message clear and grounded in truth." Jamal raised a hand, his usual grin replaced by a serious line. "What about the threats?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. "Ms.?" Clark's expression darkened for a moment. "We report them, but we don't let them silence us," she said firmly. "Fear thrives in silence, and we're done being quiet." Noah felt a surge of resolve, bolstered by the people around him. This wasn't just his fight, it was theirs. The room felt warmer, filled with shared determination, and the realization that they had come too far to turn back. The next day, Noah walked to the community center to help with preparations for an upcoming rally. The streets were quieter than usual, the weight of recent events pressing down on the town like a lead blanket. As he turned the corner, a sharp noise made him stop in his tracks, a voice raised in anger. "Think you're better than the rest of us, huh?" The words came from a small group of men standing by a truck. Eric Turner was among them, eyes fixed on Noah with a mixture of disdain and fury. Noah took a breath, willing himself to stay calm. He kept walking, the tension in his back muscles coiled tight. "You're tearing this town apart, Carter," Eric called after him, his voice cutting through the quiet morning. "And for what? So you can feel important?" Noah stopped, turning slowly to face the group. The morning sun cast long shadows, making their expressions harder to read, but he could feel the hostility rolling off them in waves. "I'm not trying to tear anything apart," Noah said, his voice steady but low. "I'm trying to fix what's already broken." Eric scoffed, taking a step forward. "You think this makes you a hero? People like you don't change anything. You just make noise until the town forgets and goes back to normal." Before Noah could reply, a voice called from behind. "That's enough, Eric." Officer Daniels stood at the end of the street, his stance firm and eyes unwavering. Eric hesitated, the muscles in his jaw working as if chewing over a retort. But he didn't say anything, turning away with a muttered curse as he and his friends climbed back into the truck and sped off. Daniels approached, his eyes meeting Noah's with an expression that held both apology and resolve. "You okay?" he asked. Noah nodded, the tightness in his chest easing. "Thanks." Daniels didn't smile, but he placed a hand on Noah's shoulder, a silent promise that the fight was no longer his alone. The rally at the community center that evening was packed. People from all walks of life filled the room, standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces lit with a mix of hope and apprehension. Pastor Walker opened the meeting with a prayer, and Mrs. Clark stepped up next, outlining the next steps and the importance of staying unified. When Noah's turn came, he walked to the podium, his hands steady as they gripped the edges. The room quieted, every eye focused on him. "We've come a long way," he began, his voice carrying through the silence. "But we're not done. This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about what's been happening for too long. And it's about making sure that from now on, Rose Hill stands for justice, not just order." A cheer rose from the crowd, swelling and filling the room. Noah stepped back, the weight on his chest lifting as he caught Mabel's eye. She nodded, her pride shining brighter than the lights overhead. As the evening waned and people began to filter out into the cool night, Noah stood on the front steps of the community center, watching them go. The air was charged, the town alive with a new kind of energy. It was the kind of night that made you believe change was not only possible, but already happening. And for the first time in a long while, Noah felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Standing on the edge of a future they would shape together, step by determined step. The rally at the community center had energized Noah and his supporters, but with that energy came a sharp awareness of the stakes. The morning after the gathering, the streets of Rose Hill buzzed with a current that seemed to crackle beneath the surface. People spoke in low voices, glancing over their shoulders as if the town itself were listening. Noah felt the weight of the newfound attention as he walked to Sanders' Grocers. He was used to familiar greetings and smiles, but today there were sidelong glances and tight-lipped nods. Even Mr. Sanders, who always met him with a warm "good morning," wore a more somber expression. "Things are different now, son," Mr. Sanders said, leaning on the counter as Noah stacked cans of soup on the shelf. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "Not everyone's happy with what's happening. You watch yourself, you hear?" "I know," Noah replied, pausing mid-stack. He glanced at the older man, whose brow was furrowed. "I'll be careful." "Good," Mr. Sanders said, straightening up and adjusting his apron. "You're doing the right thing, but that doesn't mean it'll be easy." The words sat heavy in Noah's chest. He knew the road they were on was paved with more than just support. It was littered with skepticism, anger, and the fear of change. That evening, Mrs. Clark's house was lit with a warm glow, its windows revealing the bustling gathering inside. The small space was filled with community members who had become the backbone of their movement. Jamal was there, sitting at the dining table with a notepad full of ideas. Mrs. Jenkins poured cups of tea, her hands steady despite her age. Even Officer Daniels had shown up, standing off to the side, his presence both reassuring and a reminder of the tension they faced. Noah stood near the kitchen, listening as Mrs. Clark outlined the plans for their next steps. "The preliminary suspension of Officer Harrison is only the beginning," she said, her voice strong and unwavering. "We need to press for a deeper review into other complaints. This isn't just one incident, it's a pattern." Murmurs of agreement filled the room. Pastor Walker nodded, adding, "We should prepare a petition. Show them that it's not just a few voices calling for change, it's the whole community." Jamal scribbled furiously, then looked up. "I can get signatures at the high school. A lot of us know people who've had run-ins with the police." Noah's chest swelled with a mix of pride and determination. This was bigger than him now, and seeing others step forward made the burden feel lighter, even if just for a moment. But the mood was tempered when Mrs. Jenkins spoke up, her voice low. I heard Eric Turner and his friends talking outside the store today, she said, eyes shadowed with concern. They're saying this isn't over, that they won't let things change without a fight. A silence settled over the room, the weight of the warning pressing down on them. Officer Daniels shifted, his jaw tightening. We need to be cautious, he said. Pushback like this can escalate quickly. Ms.? Clark's eyes met Noah's, a question hanging between them. He nodded once, understanding that caution and courage would need to walk hand in hand. The next day, the petition efforts began in earnest. Noah spent his morning at the park, clipboard in hand, speaking with residents who had gathered to watch their children play or chat on benches. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. At first, people were hesitant, their faces clouded with doubt as they listened to Noah's rehearsed speech. We're not trying to disrupt the peace, he would say, making eye contact and trying to infuse his voice with sincerity. We just want fairness, so everyone can feel safe. Slowly, names began to appear on the list. An older man named Mr. Alvarez, who Noah recognized from the grocery store, signed first. I remember when things were simpler, he said, his hand trembling slightly as he wrote. But simple doesn't mean fair. You're doing good, kid. Noah's heart lifted at the words, but it wasn't long before resistance made itself known. As he approached a small group near the park's entrance, one man, tall with a worn cap pulled low over his eyes, scoffed. Why don't you let this go, Carter? You're making it worse for everyone, he said, crossing his arms and leaning back on the bench. Noah stood his ground, his heartbeat picking up. If speaking up makes things worse, then maybe that's proof we need to change things. The man's mouth twisted into a sneer. You're not changing anything except making enemies. Before Noah could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension. Is there a problem here? Jamal appeared at Noah's side, eyes narrowed. The man glanced at Jamal, his posture relaxing, but his glare unfaltering. Just offering some advice, he muttered, before pushing off the bench and walking away. Thanks, Noah said, exhaling the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Jamal smirked. What are friends for? Now let's get back to it. We've got work to do. That evening, the town square felt alive in a way that made Noah's skin tingle with anticipation. Ms. Clark had called for a gathering to discuss the results of their petition, which had garnered over 500 signatures. The turnout was larger than expected. People stood shoulder to shoulder, their breath fogging in the cool night air. The square, usually reserved for summer markets and holiday celebrations, had become a stage for a different kind of community engagement. Pastor Walker took the podium first, his deep voice ringing out as he welcomed everyone. Tonight, we stand not as separate voices but as one. And tonight, we send a message that cannot be ignored. Applause swept through the crowd, echoing off the old brick buildings. Noah stood in the front row with Mabel, who had insisted on coming despite the chill in the air. She looked up at him, eyes filled with pride and something else, worry that she hadn't voiced, but that they both felt. Ms. Clark stepped up next, holding the petition in her hands. We have gathered over 500 signatures from people in this town who believe in fairness, in justice, she announced, lifting the document like a beacon. We will be delivering this to the mayor's office tomorrow. More cheers erupted, but before the sound could fully settle, a voice shouted from the edge of the crowd. This isn't justice. It's a witch hunt. All eyes turned as Eric Turner and a handful of others stood on the sidewalk, faces hard with defiance. The crowd shifted uneasily, whispers threading through the tension. Ms. Clark didn't flinch. Eric, everyone is entitled to their opinion, but tonight is about moving forward as a community, she said, her voice steady. Eric took a step forward, eyes glinting in the dim light. Moving forward? You think dragging this town through the mud is progress? You're just stirring up trouble. Noah's pulse raced, but before he could react, Mabel's voice cut through the crowd, clear and unwavering. Change always feels like trouble to those who fear it, she said, turning to face Eric. But without it, We stay stuck in the same wrongs, year after year. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Eric's expression faltered for just a moment before hardening again. He looked at Noah, a challenge burning in his eyes, before turning on his heel and walking away, his followers trailing behind him. The tension slowly eased as people returned their attention to the podium. "Ms.?" Clark glanced at Mabel, a faint smile of gratitude crossing her lips. "Thank you, Mabel," she said softly. Noah reached for his grandmother's hand, squeezing it gently. The night pressed on, filled with speeches, stories, and shared hope. Despite the interruption, it felt like a victory, a reminder that their voices carried weight. The next morning, as promised, Noah, Mrs. Clark, and a small group of supporters walked to the mayor's office, the petition in hand. The sun glinted off the town's old clock tower, casting long shadows as they approached the large brick building. The mayor, Harold Thompson, met them in the conference room, his expression guarded. He was a man known for navigating the political waters of Rose Hill with careful diplomacy, balancing the desires of its residents with the realities of governance. "Miss," Clark handed over the petition, her eyes locked on his. "Mayor Thompson, these are the voices of your town. We ask that you listen." The mayor took the papers, his eyes scanning the names before he nodded slowly. "I hear you, Rosa. I hear all of you," he said, looking up at the small group. "And I assure you, this will be taken into serious consideration as we move forward with the investigation." There was a pause, a moment where hope and skepticism hung in balance. Then, as the group turned to leave, the mayor added, "Change doesn't come without pushback. Be prepared." Noah met Miss Clark's eyes, and she nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. They were prepared. They had to be. That night, as Noah sat in his room, the house quiet around him, he felt the weight of everything pressing down. The threats, the moments of doubt, the spark of hope that had carried him this far. He looked at the photo of his parents on the nightstand, their smiles frozen in time, a reminder of the strength that ran in his blood. A soft knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. Mabel peeked in, her face lined with worry but softened by a smile. "You should rest, Noah. Tomorrow's another big day." He nodded, feeling the exhaustion seep into his bones. "I will, Gran." As she left, Noah lay back on his bed, eyes on the ceiling. The town outside was a place caught between shadows and light, fear and hope. But in that moment, he felt something solid and unyielding take root in his chest. Determination. They had come too far to stop now. The battle for Rose Hill's future was far from over, but for the first time, Noah believed it could be won. The wind howled through the town of Rose Hill that morning, carrying with it the promise of rain. It whipped leaves into small tornadoes and set the trees swaying in a rhythmic dance. Noah stood at the window of his room, watching the world outside shift and change, much like the town itself. It had been days since the petition had been handed over to Mayor Harold Thompson, and the waiting gnawed at everyone involved in the movement. Mabel's voice drifted from the kitchen, humming an old gospel tune that was both comforting and melancholic. It was her way of keeping steady when things felt out of her control. Noah glanced at the photograph of his parents, its edges worn from years of handling, and wondered what they would think of the fight he was leading. Would they be proud, or worried about the storm that had become his life? A sudden rap at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. Jamal's familiar voice called out, "Noah, you in there?" "Yeah, come in," Noah replied, turning from the window. Jamal entered, the brim of his baseball cap shadowing his eyes but not hiding the urgency in them. He was holding his phone, the screen aglow with a news alert. "You need to see this," he said, handing it over. Noah's eyes skimmed the headline. "Tensions escalate as Rose Hill faces pressure over police investigation." The article detailed the pushback from certain town residents who believed the investigation was an overreach, a threat to the town's unity. There were quotes from Eric Turner and others who had doubled down on their stance against Noah and the movement. But there were also statements of support from people Noah hadn't even known were following the story. "It's getting bigger," Jamal said, his voice tinged with both excitement and worry. "It's not just Rose Hill anymore. People outside town are paying attention." Noah felt a shiver run down his spine. The spotlight was expanding, and with it came a sharper edge of risk. But it also meant that the battle was reaching places it needed to. More eyes meant more accountability. "Where's Mrs. Clark?" Noah asked, handing the phone back. "She's at the community center. Said she's organizing something for tomorrow, an open forum so people can talk about their concerns. Pastor Walker's going to moderate." Noah nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. The forum could be a turning point, a chance to show that their movement wasn't just noise, but a genuine effort to bring change. But it could also bring out the worst in those opposed to it. "Let's head over," he said, grabbing his jacket from the chair. The community center was a flurry of activity. Volunteers moved in and out, setting up chairs and arranging tables. Ms. Clark stood at the front, her presence commanding even amid the chaos. Her eyes lit up when she saw Noah and Jamal enter. "Noah, good. I was hoping you'd be here," she said, wiping her hands on a towel and walking over. "This forum is going to be critical. We need to show that we're not just angry, we're constructive." "I get that," Noah said, glancing around at the bustling room. "But what if it turns into a shouting match? There are still a lot of people who don't want to listen." "That's why Pastor Walker is moderating, Mrs. Clark said, the corners of her mouth lifting in a small smile. "He has a way of calming people down, making them think before they speak." Jamal added, "And it's not just about convincing everyone. If we show we're open to dialogue, it's harder for them to paint us as troublemakers." Noah nodded, absorbing their words. His gaze drifted to the large windows where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows. It felt like a metaphor for their situation, light fighting to break through the dark. The following evening, the community center buzzed with tension as people filed in. Folding chairs had been set up in rows, and a microphone stood at the front, waiting like a silent judge. Noah sat near the front with Mabel, Jamal, and Mrs. Jenkins. Ms. Clark and Pastor Walker stood off to the side, deep in conversation. The room was packed, filled with a cross-section of Rose Hill. Shop owners, teachers, parents, teenagers with skeptical expressions, and even members of the town council. In the back corner, Noah saw Officer Daniels, his posture straight, eyes alert but conflicted. Pastor Walker stepped up to the microphone, raising his hands to quiet the room. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice resonant. "Tonight we're here to listen, to speak, and, most importantly, to understand. Let's keep this respectful." The first to approach the microphone was Mrs. Alvarez, who ran the local bakery. She spoke about fairness, her voice wavering with emotion as she recounted the stories she'd heard from her customers. Young men and women, black and white, who'd been harassed or intimidated. Applause followed her words, but it was tempered. The crowd remained tense, like an animal waiting to see if it should run or fight. Next, a man Noah didn't recognize stood up. His face was lined with years of hard work, and his denim jacket was worn at the elbows. "I've lived in this town my whole life," he said, eyes scanning the room. "And I've seen the good and the bad. But what's happening now? It's got people scared. Scared of change. Scared of what we might find if we keep looking." Murmurs swept through the audience. Noah's heart thudded as he watched, sensing the room teeter on the edge. Eric Turner stepped forward next, his movements sharp, eyes full of defiance. The whispers grew louder as he adjusted the microphone. "We all want to feel safe, don't we?" he began, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But what's happening now? It's not safety. It's chaos. This isn't how you build a community. This is how you tear it apart." Noah felt a surge of anger but forced himself to stay calm. He glanced at Mrs. Clark, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floor as he moved to the front. Eric's eyes followed him, narrowing as Noah approached the microphone. "You're right, Eric," Noah said. surprising even himself with the steadiness of his voice. We do want to feel safe. But safety isn't just not being afraid of change. It's knowing that you won't be treated differently because of who you are. It's knowing that justice applies to everyone. The room fell silent, every face turned toward him. Noah felt the weight of their eyes but pushed forward. What we're doing isn't about chaos. It's about making sure that everyone in Rose Hill feels they belong, that they're seen, heard, and protected. A slow clap started from somewhere in the room. Noah glanced back to see Mr. Alvarez nodding, a small smile breaking the tension in his face. The applause spread, tentative at first, then swelling until it filled the space. Eric's jaw tightened, but he stepped back without another word. Pastor Walker took the mic again, a look of pride flickering in his eyes. Thank you, Noah. And thank you to everyone who's spoken tonight. This is what community looks like. Not everyone agreeing, but everyone being willing to listen. The next day, the sense of cautious optimism lingered in the air. The open forum had shown that while the town was divided, there was still room for dialogue. But the day was far from over, and the tension remained as palpable as ever. Noah walked to Sanders' Grocer's, where the familiar chime of the bell announced his arrival. Mr. Sanders looked up from his register, a smile breaking through the lines of his face. Heard about last night, he said, his voice carrying both admiration and concern. You did good, Noah. You keep surprising this old man. Thanks, Mr. Sanders, Noah said, a hint of a smile crossing his lips. The store was quiet that morning, the usual customers coming and going, their interactions tinted with a newfound awareness. Some offered Noah encouraging words. Others passed by with tight, unreadable expressions. Just as Noah was restocking a shelf near the back, the bell chimed again. This time, it was followed by heavier footsteps, and the air seemed to shift. He turned and saw Eric Turner standing by the door, arms crossed, eyes locked on him. Mr. Sanders tensed behind the counter, his fingers pausing mid-count. The room seemed to shrink as Eric approached. We need to talk, Eric said, his voice low. Noah's heart pounded, but he nodded. What about? Eric glanced around, noting the eyes on them. He sighed, the defiance in his expression giving way to something else, something harder to read. Not here, out back. Noah hesitated, catching Mr. Sanders' worried gaze. The older man gave a subtle shake of his head, but Noah turned back to Eric, nodding once. All right, he said, following Eric through the stockroom and out the back door into the alley. The air was cold, the wind sharp as it funneled between the brick walls. Eric stopped, turning to face Noah, his expression unreadable. Look, Eric began, crossing his arms tightly against his chest. I don't agree with what you're doing, stirring all this up. It's causing problems. I know, Noah said, meeting his eyes. But some problems are worth facing. Eric's jaw worked, as if grinding over unspoken words. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rustle of a plastic bag caught in the wind. My father was a cop, Eric said suddenly, eyes hardening. Served this town for 30 years. He taught me that keeping order is the only way to keep peace. But things have changed, and I'm not sure where I stand anymore. Noah's breath caught in his throat. This was more than he had expected, a crack in the armor Eric had worn so tightly. We're not trying to destroy anything, Eric, Noah said, his voice softer now. We're trying to make it better. For everyone. Eric looked away, the set of his jaw softening. The tension between them eased just slightly, like the moment before rain breaks. Just remember, Noah, Eric said finally, turning back with a look that was half warning, half something else. Not everyone wants things to change. With that, he walked away, leaving Noah standing in the cold alley, the weight of the exchange pressing down on him. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was something, an opening, a sliver of understanding in a town that was learning how to face its truths. That night, as Noah sat on the porch with Mabel, watching the stars emerge one by one, he felt the day's events settle in his chest. The battle was far from over, but cracks were forming in the walls that had once seemed impenetrable. Mabel leaned back in her chair, a soft smile playing on her lips. "The night is always darkest before the dawn," she said, echoing words she had told him since childhood. Noah nodded, eyes on the sky. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight he felt a flicker of hope, fragile but real. The town was at a crossroads, and no matter what path it took, he would be there, fighting for its better future. This chapter delves into the tension between opposing views in Rose Hill, showcasing moments of conflict, dialogue, and an uneasy understanding. Noah's resolve strengthens as the community continues to grapple with change, highlighting the complexity of progress and the importance of persistence. The day after Noah's unexpected conversation with Eric Turner, the town of Rose Hill awoke to an uneasy calm. The sun struggled to pierce through dense gray clouds that hung heavy in the sky, threatening rain. The weight of the weather mirrored the tension that had settled over the town, as if everyone was waiting for something to break. Noah stood in the hallway outside his bedroom, listening to the familiar clatter of Mabel's cooking in the kitchen. She always made pancakes when she sensed he needed a boost. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the exhaustion settle into his bones. It was a different kind of tiredness, not just physical, but the kind that came from carrying the hopes of an entire community on his shoulders. His phone buzzed on the bedside table, startling him. He picked it up and saw a message from Jamal. "Meeting at Mrs. Clark's house. Urgent. Be there soon." The single line sent a jolt through him, banishing any remaining sleepiness. He slipped into his sneakers, grabbed his jacket, and called out to Mabel, "Gran, I'm heading out for a bit. I'll be back later." Mabel appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Is everything all right, Noah?" she asked, worry lines deepening on her forehead. He hesitated, taking in her tired eyes and the way she clutched the towel like a lifeline. "I hope so," he said, giving her a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'll be careful." "I know you will," she said, but the shadow of concern lingered as he shut the door behind him. Ms. Clark's living room was buzzing with conversation when Noah arrived. The tension was palpable, and the faces of the gathered group were a mix of determination and worry. Jamal sat at the dining table, fingers tapping a nervous rhythm, while Pastor Walker stood by the window, looking out at the street as if expecting trouble. Ms. Clark motioned for Noah to come in. "We just got word that the mayor's office is planning to make an announcement tonight," she said, voice brisk. "But we don't know what they're going to say. Some think it's about the investigation. Others believe it's a way to placate the opposition." Noah felt a knot form in his stomach. The petition, the meetings, the rally, it all felt like it was building to this moment. But what would it mean if the mayor's words fell short of their demands? What if all their work unraveled with a few carefully chosen platitudes? "We need to be ready, whatever happens," Pastor Walker said, turning to face the room. His presence was steadying, a reminder that they weren't just reacting, they were fighting for something bigger. "If it's in our favor, we move forward with momentum. If it's not, we double down and show that we won't be ignored." A murmur of agreement swept through the room. Mrs. Jenkins, sitting in her usual chair, nodded vigorously. "We've come too far to let them brush this under the rug," she said, her voice stronger than usual. Noah caught Officer Daniels' eye as he entered the room, a subtle nod passing between them. Daniels had become a quiet supporter, offering insights from inside the department that no one else could. His presence was a reminder that not everyone in uniform was an opponent. "Jamal and I will spread the word," Noah said, glancing at his friend, who nodded in agreement. "People need to know that this announcement could change things." "Ms.?" Clark's eyes softened with pride. "You're becoming quite the leader, Noah," she said. "Your parents would be proud." The words hit him square in the chest, igniting a spark of resolve that carried him through the next few hours of planning and preparation. The town square was already filling up by the time the sun began to set, casting a muted orange glow that struggled against the gray sky. The scent of rain thickened the air, and people moved with a nervous energy, their conversations punctuated by laughter that sounded strained. Noah stood near the center with Mabel at his side, Mrs. Clark and Pastor Walker nearby. Mayor Harold Thompson appeared on the steps of the town hall, flanked by town council members and Chief Rollins. The crowd quieted as the mayor raised a hand, his expression serious, eyes scanning the sea of faces before him. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice steady but carrying an edge of weariness. "These past few weeks have shown us that our town is not as unified as we once believed. The events surrounding Officer Harrison's conduct and the subsequent investigation have exposed rifts in our community that must be addressed." A murmur ran through the crowd, but Noah's eyes stayed locked on the mayor. He felt Mabel's hand slip into his, a silent show of support. "After careful review, we have determined that Officer Harrison's actions did violate multiple department protocols," the mayor continued, pausing as gasps and shouts erupted. "Effective immediately, he will be terminated from his position." Relief washed over Noah like a wave, strong enough to buckle his knees if he let it. A cheer broke out, mingled with the sounds of disbelief and anger from others. "Ms. Clark's eyes glistened as she exchanged a glance with Pastor Walker, their expressions reflecting a shared victory. "But," the mayor said, raising his voice to cut through the noise, "this does not mean our work is done. We will be conducting a full audit of the department to ensure that this kind of conduct is addressed and prevented moving forward." Before he could continue, a voice shouted from the crowd, "This is a disgrace! You're tearing down good men." It was Eric Turner, his face flushed with anger. He stood surrounded by a cluster of his friends, their expressions a mix of rage and confusion. The crowd erupted, voices clashing in a cacophony of arguments. Noah felt the fragile thread holding the moment together start to snap. The rain began to fall in earnest, droplets hitting the pavement with sharp taps as the crowd's energy shifted from celebration to confrontation. People pushed past each other, arguments flaring like sparks as more voices joined the fray. Mabel pulled Noah back a step, her hand firm on his arm. "Stay close, Noah," she warned, eyes scanning the crowd. Eric Turner stepped forward, pushing through the mass of people until he stood a few feet from Noah. His eyes blazed, teeth bared in a snarl. "This is your fault, Carter. You and your so-called fight for justice." Noah's heart pounded, but he stood his ground, meeting Eric's stare. "This is bigger than just me, Eric. It's about fairness for everyone." Eric's fists clenched, and for a moment it seemed like he might swing. The crowd around them seemed to sense the shift. A collective breath held as the tension reached its peak. "Enough!" a voice boomed, cutting through the noise like a whip. Officer Daniels stepped between them, his uniform drenched, but his presence unyielding. "This isn't the way to resolve this." The silence that followed was deafening. Rain soaked into Noah's clothes, chilling him to the bone, but he barely noticed. Eric's gaze wavered, and he took a step back, his anger dissolving into uncertainty. Daniels turned to face the crowd, raising his voice above the patter of rain. "This town is better than this. We don't have to agree, but we do have to respect each other if we're going to move forward." A few people clapped, tentative but growing stronger. The anger in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a somber understanding. Eric cast one last glance at Noah before turning and disappearing into the crowd. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a town that felt washed clean but raw, like an open wound. The news of Officer Harrison's termination spread quickly, igniting conversations in coffee shops, over backyard fences, and in line at Sanders' Grocers. The community audit promised by the mayor was met with a mix of hope and skepticism. Noah spent the day fielding questions and quiet congratulations from people who, until now, had stayed silent. He could see the shift happening, a cautious willingness to acknowledge that change might be necessary. Mabel watched him from the kitchen table, her eyes following him as he paced the room, speaking to Mrs. Clark on the phone. "Yes, I think we need to push for public forums during the audit," he said. "People need to be involved in this. When he hung up, Mabel patted the seat next to her. Come sit, Noah. You need a break. He hesitated, but finally sat down, the exhaustion catching up with him. Mabel reached out, smoothing the hair from his forehead. You've done more than enough for today, my boy, she said, her voice full of love and pride. Rest now. The road is still long, but you've taken the hardest steps. Noah leaned back in the chair, letting the warmth of her words settle over him like a blanket. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a moment of peace. Later that evening, as dusk settled over the town, Noah stepped outside to the porch. The sky was painted with deep purples and reds, a beautiful end to a day that felt like the turning of a page. Jamal walked up the driveway, hands in his pockets and a grin on his face. Thought I'd find you here, he said, leaning against the porch railing. How does it feel knowing you helped make this happen? Noah looked out at the quiet street, the houses bathed in the soft glow of porch lights. It feels surreal, he admitted. But it's not over yet. Jamal nodded. No, but it's a start. And you made people see that it's possible. They stood in silence for a while, the night settling around them like a comforting blanket. In the distance, the sound of children laughing carried on the breeze, a reminder that life continued, even in the midst of change. Noah took a deep breath, the air cool and clean. The fight for Rose Hill wasn't over, but tonight it felt winnable, and that was enough to keep him going. The sun rose gently over Rose Hill, casting warm light across the damp streets that still glistened from the previous night's rain. The town looked different in the soft glow of the morning, as if the storm had washed away more than just the dust and grime. It had cleared the air of old grudges, leaving room for something new. Noah sat on the front porch with Mabel, who sipped her coffee slowly, eyes lost in thought. The porch creaked under Noah's shifting weight as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, gazing out at the street that had been the backdrop of his entire life. The quiet felt different now, less tense and more full of possibility. A car turned the corner, its engine a familiar purr. Ms. Rosa Clark stepped out and waved as she approached, the hem of her coat flaring slightly in the breeze. Her stride was brisk, eyes bright despite the lines of exhaustion etched into her face. Noah, Mabel, she greeted, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who had seen a glimpse of change and wanted to share it. Do you mind if I come up? Mabel smiled and gestured with her cup. Always welcome, Rosa. Ms. Clark took a seat next to Noah, the wood creaking as she leaned back. I just came from the mayor's office, she began, glancing at them both. They're serious about this audit. It's going to be thorough, and they want the community to be involved in shaping the process. Noah's pulse quickened, the knot in his chest loosening with each word. Does that mean public forums? Ms. Clark nodded. Yes, and they're asking for volunteers to help lead discussions, collect stories, and build trust with the people who've been afraid to come forward. Mabel's smile was small but proud as she looked at Noah. Sounds like you, doesn't it? He chuckled softly, the weight of her words settling on him like a warm blanket. I guess it does, Ms. Clark's expression turned serious, though her eyes were still kind. This is the hard part, Noah. Talking about change is one thing. Living it, building it, that's where we need to show up every day, even when it's difficult. Noah nodded, the significance of what she was saying sinking in. The rallies, the speeches, and the petitions were just the beginning. The real work lay in the quieter moments, the conversations, the compromises, the slow, steady rebuilding of trust. Later that day, Noah walked to the park where Jamal and a group of their friends were playing basketball. The sound of the ball thumping against the pavement and the laughter of his friends made Noah's heart feel lighter. Jamal spotted him and waved him over, a wide grin on his face. Hey, man! Thought you were too busy being the hero of Rose Hill to play ball with us, Jamal teased, the sparkle in his eyes making it clear that it was all in good fun. Guess I can squeeze in a game or two, Noah said, the smile coming more easily now. He shrugged off his jacket and joined them, feeling the tension of the past few weeks ebb with each pass, each shout of encouragement. Each missed shot. As the game wound down, Jamal draped an arm over Noah's shoulders, both of them panting and sweating under the afternoon sun. "So what now, Mr. Changemaker?" Noah looked out at the park, the swings swaying gently, children chasing each other with carefree shouts. "Now, we make sure this momentum doesn't fade. We help people tell their stories, show them that they're not alone." Jamal nodded, his expression turning serious. "Yeah, man. And we make sure no one forgets why we started this in the first place." The first public forum was held the following week at the community center. The hall was packed, with every chair occupied and people standing along the walls. The atmosphere buzzed with a mix of curiosity, apprehension, and a shared sense of purpose. Pastor Walker stood at the front, flanked by Mrs. Clark and Chief Rollins, who wore an expression of cautious optimism. Noah sat near the front with Mabel and Mrs. Jenkins, who kept glancing around as if she couldn't believe the turnout. Officer Daniels was there too, standing off to the side, a quiet pillar of support. Pastor Walker raised his hands, and the room quieted. "We are here today to talk, to listen, and to begin the process of healing and change. This is a chance for anyone who wishes to share their experiences, to speak without fear." The first few moments were hesitant, the room holding its breath as people exchanged glances. Finally, Mr. Alvarez stood up, clearing his throat. "I never thought I'd see the day where we'd be here talking about this," he said, his voice strong despite his years. "I've seen things happen in this town that shouldn't have been ignored. But I stayed quiet because it felt easier. Not anymore." A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd, soft murmurs and nods. One by one, others stood to speak. Tasha, who had faced unjust treatment in high school. Ben, who had watched his brother leave town after a similar incident. Their stories wove together, forming a tapestry of shared pain and the silent promise of solidarity. When it was Noah's turn to speak, he stood up slowly, the eyes of his community on him. "I didn't want any of this when it started," he began, his voice steady. "I just wanted to feel safe in my own town, to know that I wouldn't be treated differently because of who I am. But this has become about so much more than just me." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of strangers who were no longer strangers but allies. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what we've been through. It's about making sure that Rose Hill is a place where everyone feels seen and heard." Applause filled the room, loud and uncontainable, rolling through the space like a wave. Noah sat down, heart pounding, as Mabel squeezed his hand. "You've found your voice, Noah," she whispered, pride shining in her eyes. "And you've helped others find theirs." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Committees were formed, meetings were held, and volunteers stepped forward to support the audit and the community forums. People who had never spoken out before found themselves sharing their stories, their voices adding weight to the movement. The town began to feel different, as if a collective breath had been released and replaced with a newfound determination. One afternoon, as Noah walked down Main Street, he saw a familiar figure sitting outside the coffee shop. Eric Turner sat at a table, his head down, fingers drumming on the wooden surface. Noah hesitated, but then walked over, feeling a mix of apprehension and resolve. "Mind if I join you?" Noah asked, standing at the edge of the table. Eric looked up, surprise flashing across his face before it settled into something unreadable. He shrugged. "Suit yourself." Noah sat, the silence between them heavy but not hostile. He glanced at Eric, noting the way his shoulders were tense, his jaw set. "I know this hasn't been easy for you," Noah said after a moment. "For any of us." Eric's eyes met his, hard but not as confrontational as before. "It's not just about what happened," Eric said, voice low. "It's about everything changing at once. People don't know what to do with that." "I get it," Noah replied. "Change is hard, but staying the same when we know something's wrong, that's harder." Eric's fingers stopped drumming. He looked away, eyes following a pair of kids running down the street. "I'm not saying you're wrong," he said finally, "but it's going to take time for people to see it the way you do." Noah nodded, a small smile forming. Then we'll take that time. Eric didn't respond, but he didn't walk away either. They sat in silence as the sun moved higher in the sky, casting shadows that shifted with each passing minute. The community audit began in earnest, with public records opened and past complaints revisited. Officer Daniels became an active part of the reform committee, working alongside Mrs. Clark and other community leaders to ensure the process was transparent and fair. Noah found himself spending long evenings at the community center, surrounded by stacks of papers and the hum of conversation as people pieced together what had once been hidden. It was exhausting work, but it was also invigorating. One evening, as he sorted through old reports, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Jamal, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Thought you could use a pick-me-up," Jamal said, handing him one. "Thanks, man," Noah said, taking a sip and feeling the warmth spread through him. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Jamal grinned. "Probably pass out from exhaustion. Besides, you're not doing this alone. We're all in it with you." The words settled into Noah's chest, anchoring him in the reality that this fight was not just his own. It belonged to everyone who had been overlooked, everyone who believed that Rose Hill could be better. Months passed, and the town of Rose Hill began to change in ways both subtle and significant. New policies were put in place, training programs introduced, and community forums became a regular part of civic life. The conversations were not always easy, but they were necessary, and people were learning that progress came not from sweeping gestures, but from the accumulation of many small, persistent acts. One summer evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky with hues of orange and pink, Noah stood on the same porch where he had spent so many mornings and nights looking out at the world. Mabel joined him, her presence a comforting constant. "You did it, Noah," she said, her voice carrying the weight of everything they had been through. "You helped change this town." He turned to her, eyes glistening. "We did it, Gran. All of us." They watched as neighbors walked by, waving and chatting in the glow of streetlights that now seemed to shine a little brighter. Rose Hill wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was different. It was a place where voices could be heard, where change was no longer just a distant hope, but a living, breathing part of the community. As the stars began to appear one by one, Noah felt a deep sense of peace. The road had been long, and it would continue, but he was ready for whatever came next. The future was unwritten, and for the first time, he felt confident in helping shape it. And so, under the vast starlit sky, the town of Rose Hill stood on new foundations, stronger and more united than ever before. Rose Hill awoke to the songs of birds and the scent of honeysuckle on the wind. The town had weathered storms before, but none had reshaped it like this. The recent months had tested relationships, challenged beliefs, and forced the community to confront hard truths. Yet, as the days slipped into summer, a cautious hope began to take root. Fragile but persistent. Noah Carter sat at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee cooling in front of him. The sun streamed through the lace curtains, warming the worn wood beneath his hands. Mabel moved around the kitchen with a practiced ease, her every gesture a quiet reminder of resilience. She glanced at Noah and paused, smiling softly. "Thinking deep thoughts this morning?" she asked, her voice teasing but warm. Noah chuckled, lifting his mug for a sip. "I guess I'm just trying to make sense of it all," he admitted, eyes flickering to the window where the street outside hummed with life. The changes they'd fought for were in motion, but the process was anything but smooth. Mabel sat across from him, folding her hands on the table. "Change doesn't always come clean and easy, Noah. Sometimes it's messy, but messy is better than stuck." Before he could reply, a knock at the door interrupted. Noah stood and opened it to find Mrs. Rosa Clark and Officer Daniels, both dressed casually but exuding purpose. The sight of them together was a testament to how far things had come. "Good morning, Noah." "Mabel, Ms." Clark said, stepping inside as Daniels followed. "We have some news, and we thought it best to share it in person." Daniels nodded, a small smile breaking the seriousness of his expression. The first stage of the audit is complete. Chief Rollins has approved new guidelines for handling complaints, and he's backing a community oversight board. Noah's eyes widened as a surge of relief washed over him. "That's huge," he said, glancing at Mabel, who had tears glistening at the corners of her eyes. "It is," Miss Clark said, her smile broadening. "But there's more work to do. We need to make sure the Oversight Board represents everyone, especially those who felt unheard before." Mabel reached over and squeezed Noah's hand. "Looks like you'll be busy, my boy." Noah met her eyes, and in that moment he felt the weight of responsibility settle comfortably on his shoulders. "I'm ready," he said. The following days were filled with meetings and planning sessions. The community center became a hub of activity, buzzing with the sounds of voices raised in debate, laughter, and the occasional frustrated sigh. Papers and folders littered tables, marked with notes and ideas that would help shape the Oversight Board and ensure its effectiveness. Noah was sitting with Jamal and Tasha, poring over a list of potential board members, when a familiar voice interrupted. "Hope I'm not too late to pitch in," said Eric Turner, standing in the doorway with a tentative look. The room fell silent for a moment, eyes turning to Noah. Jamal shifted in his seat, his expression wary. Noah felt his heart beat faster, but kept his face neutral. "Eric," he said, standing up, "what brings you here?" Eric looked at the floor, shifting his weight. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, voice lower than usual. "I still don't agree with everything, but I can't pretend that things don't need to change. I want to help." The room buzzed with whispered conversations. "Ms.?" Clark stepped forward, eyes thoughtful. "Everyone who wants to contribute is welcome, as long as they respect the process," she said. Jamal leaned in close to Noah, voice low. "You sure about this?" Noah nodded, keeping his eyes on Eric. "Yeah, if he's serious, then we give him a chance." Eric's eyes flicked up, meeting Noah's, and in that brief moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. The past was heavy, but the future was still being written. The first open meeting of the Oversight Board was held at the high school gymnasium. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the polished wooden floor, filling up quickly as residents poured in. The atmosphere crackled with energy, charged by anticipation and the lingering traces of skepticism. Noah sat at the front with Mrs. Clark, Pastor Walker, and Officer Daniels. Eric stood to the side, arms crossed but eyes attentive. The meeting began with introductions, each board member standing to share their reasons for being involved. Noah's heart thudded as he rose to speak. He scanned the room, seeing familiar faces. Mr. Sanders, Mrs. Jenkins, Jamal, and even those who had once looked at him with mistrust. "I'm here because Rose Hill needs to be a place where everyone feels seen and heard," Noah said, voice steady but carrying an edge of emotion. "This isn't just about holding people accountable. It's about building trust and ensuring that fairness isn't just a word we say, but a promise we keep." Applause echoed through the gym, some hesitant but most earnest. Noah sat down, a rush of warmth spreading through him as he glanced at Mabel, who gave him a small nod, her eyes glistening. The meeting moved forward, discussions alternating between procedural details and personal stories. People shared moments of frustration and hope, their voices weaving together into a mosaic of experiences that painted the town's true, complicated picture. Some stories were difficult to hear, accounts of unfair treatment, fear, and anger, but they were balanced by moments of resilience and kindness. Eric surprised everyone when he stood up, clearing his throat. The room quieted, eyes narrowing with curiosity or skepticism. "I know some of you think I don't belong here," he began, hands gripping the edges of the podium. "And maybe I didn't, not before. But I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to do better." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd, but no one interrupted. Eric glanced at Noah before continuing. "We can't change the past, but we can decide what we do with today. And today, I'm here to listen." The silence that followed was heavy, but it was different than before. It was filled with the realization that even the hardest hearts could soften, even if just a little. Eric stepped back, eyes scanning the room, looking for acceptance he wasn't sure he'd find. Pastor Walker stepped up to the microphone, his deep voice steadying the moment. We all have our reasons for being here, and none of us are perfect. But as long as we're willing to listen and learn, we can make this work. In the days after the meeting, the Oversight Board began its work in earnest. There were long hours spent reviewing old cases and discussing new protocols. People from different backgrounds who once barely spoke to each other now found themselves side by side, debating solutions and mapping out new policies. One evening, Noah and Jamal stayed late at the community center, papers and coffee cups strewn around them. The overhead lights buzzed softly, casting a warm glow over the room. Jamal pushed back in his chair, stretching his arms above his head. "Man, who would have thought we'd be doing this a year ago?" he said, shaking his head with a grin. "Not me," Noah said, laughing. "But I'm glad we are." The door creaked open, and Eric walked in, holding a stack of files. He paused when he saw them, but nodded before setting the files down on the table. "Found some old records we should go through," he said, his voice measured. "Thanks," Noah said, meeting Eric's eyes. The tension between them had eased over the weeks, replaced by a tentative camaraderie built on shared work. As the three of them sifted through the papers, the room was filled with a quiet determination. They were no longer just fighting against something, they were building something new, something that would last. The summer stretched on, and the work of the board began to show its impact. New training programs were rolled out, and community policing initiatives took shape, focusing on collaboration rather than division. The town began to feel lighter, the air tinged with cautious optimism. People talked more, not just about what was wrong, but about what could be better. Mabel watched from the front porch as Noah walked home one evening, his stride steady and head held high. He paused when he saw her, the sunset casting a golden glow over the yard. "How's my changemaker today?" she called out, her smile wide. "Tired but good," Noah said, climbing the porch steps and leaning against the railing. He looked out at the street, where kids played and neighbors exchanged greetings. The change wasn't just in the new policies, it was in the way people carried themselves, the way they looked at each other. Mabel stood and placed a hand on his arm. "You know, Noah, sometimes the biggest changes start with a single step. And you took that step when it mattered most." Noah felt a lump form in his throat. He covered Mabel's hand with his own, squeezing it gently. "I couldn't have done it without you, Gran." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the last light of day slip away. It wasn't perfect. There were still challenges, and not everyone was convinced. But it was a start, a foundation on which they could build. The next major event was the public celebration marking the official formation of the Oversight Board. Banners were strung across Main Street, and tables lined with food and drinks stretched along the park. The day of the public celebration dawned with a sky so blue it looked like it had been freshly painted. Noah stood at the edge of Rose Hill Park, surveying the preparations with a mix of excitement and nerves. Volunteers bustled about, setting up chairs, arranging tables with food and drinks, and stringing banners that read, "Rose Hill Community Oversight Board, celebrating new beginnings." The atmosphere was festive, tinged with a sense of cautious optimism. The past few months had been grueling. Every step forward had been met with resistance, yet here they were, gathered in the park, on the cusp of something that felt like hope. Noah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment press against his chest. But this time, it felt right. It felt earned. "Hey, Noah!" Jamal's voice called out as he jogged over, his grin wide and infectious. "Looks like the whole town showed up." Noah scanned the crowd that was steadily growing. People from every part of town were filtering in, filling the open space with chatter and laughter. He spotted Mrs. Rosa Clark speaking animatedly with Pastor Walker, both of them smiling as they gestured toward the makeshift stage. Even Eric Turner was there, leaning against a tree, his expression guarded but present. "It's surreal, isn't it?" Noah said, turning to Jamal. "After everything, we're finally here." "Yeah, man," Jamal agreed, giving Noah a playful punch on the arm. "You did this." "We all did." A familiar voice behind them made Noah turn. "Don't let the moment go to your head, boys," Mabel said, walking up with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. She carried a basket filled with her famous peach cobbler, and the sight of it made Noah's heart swell. It wasn't just a dessert, it was comfort, family, and resilience all wrapped into one. "Gran, you're a lifesaver," Noah said, taking the basket from her and giving her a quick hug. "Now go put that where people can enjoy it," she said, swatting him playfully. "I'm going to find Mrs. Jenkins. That woman promised me a seat up front." As the crowd settled, Chief Rollins stepped onto the stage, clearing his throat. The microphone let out a small squeal, causing a ripple of laughter to move through the audience, breaking the tension. Rollins looked out over the sea of faces, his uniform crisp, but the smile on his face softer than usual. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, the microphone catching the warmth in his tone. "This gathering isn't just to celebrate the formation of the Oversight Board. It's a celebration of what Rose Hill has become. It's a celebration of community, resilience, and the belief that we can be better." The applause that followed was strong, mingled with shouts of agreement. Noah felt a swell of pride as he looked around, catching the eyes of people who had once viewed him with doubt, but now nodded in respect. "Ms.?" Clark stepped forward next, her presence commanding as she glanced at the gathered crowd. "We've all come a long way," she said, her voice clear. "This board isn't the end, it's the beginning of a new chapter for Rose Hill. It's a commitment to listening, to learning, and to making sure that every voice is heard, no matter how small." She gestured toward Noah, who took a deep breath and stood. The crowd quieted, and he walked up to the microphone, his heart thudding in his chest. He looked out at the faces. Friends, family, former opponents turned cautious supporters. Mabel's smile steadied him, and Jamal's thumbs up made him chuckle under his breath. "I'm not going to pretend this has been easy," Noah began, his voice stronger than he expected. "It hasn't, but change never is. When we started this journey, it was about ensuring that Rose Hill was a place where everyone could feel safe, respected, and seen. We've made strides, but we have to keep pushing forward." He paused, scanning the crowd and catching sight of Eric Turner, who met his gaze with a nod that spoke more than words ever could. "We can't do this alone," Noah continued. "Change is something we build together, piece by piece. It's the small acts, the conversations, the moments of listening when we'd rather argue. That's what makes a community strong." The applause that erupted was louder this time, resonating deep in Noah's chest. He stepped back, exhaling as Mrs. Clark clapped him on the shoulder. "Well done," she whispered, her eyes bright with pride. The celebration continued with food, music, and games for the kids. The park buzzed with life, and for the first time in a long while, the tension that had gripped Rose Hill seemed to loosen. Noah wandered through the crowd, stopping to chat with friends, shaking hands with strangers who offered kind words. "Mr. Carter," a voice said, and Noah turned to see Officer Daniels standing there, hands in his pockets, a small smile on his face. "Good speech." "Thanks, Officer Daniels," Noah said, the formality feeling odd now that they had worked side by side for weeks. "And thanks for everything you did to make this possible." Daniels nodded, his eyes serious. "You reminded a lot of us why we took this job in the first place. To serve, not just enforce. That's something worth holding on to." Before Noah could respond, a cheer went up from the far side of the park where a three-legged race was starting. Laughter and shouts filled the air as people scrambled to win, their faces bright with joy. "Looks like we're moving in the right direction," Daniel said, his gaze sweeping over the scene. "Let's keep it that way." Noah's heart swelled. "We will." As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long golden shadows over the park, Mabel found Noah sitting on a picnic bench, watching the last of the kids chase each other around the playground. She sat beside him, the familiar creak of the bench a comforting sound. "It's a good day, isn't it?" she said, her voice full of contentment. "Yeah, it is," Noah said, looking at her. The lines on her face were softer in the fading light, and he could see the pride in her eyes. "You know, your mother would be so proud of you," Mabel continued, her voice thickening with emotion. "You've done what she always believed this town could do. You brought people together." Noah felt his throat tighten. He reached for Mabel's hand, holding it between his own. "I couldn't have done it without you, Gran. You taught me everything I needed to know to fight this fight." They sat in silence for a while, the noise of the celebration a gentle hum in the background. The stars began to peek out, one by one, small points of light against the darkening sky. It reminded Noah of the night he'd stood in this same park, feeling alone and overwhelmed by what seemed like an impossible task. Now, as he looked around, he saw allies, friends, and even those who had once been adversaries joining in a shared celebration. Eric Turner walked by, catching Noah's eye. He paused, then changed direction and approached the bench. Mabel straightened, her eyes narrowing with the instinctive protectiveness only a grandmother could possess. "Can I sit?" Eric asked, his voice cautious. "Of course," Noah said, shifting to make space. Mabel's eyes softened but remained watchful. Eric sat down, exhaling as if the weight he'd carried was finally lifting. "I've been meaning to say, I was wrong about a lot of things." Noah met his gaze, seeing not just an apology, but the effort it took for Eric to offer it. "We all were at different points," Noah said, "but we're here now, and that's what matters." Eric nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing. They sat in silence, three figures on a bench, watching the last light of day slip away and the town of Rosehill settle into a new chapter. As the celebration wound down and people began to drift home, Noah stood on the hill overlooking the park, the twinkling lights of the town below him. He took a deep breath, the air cool and filled with the scent of grass and summer warmth. This was what progress felt like. Not perfect, not without its struggles, but real and alive. Jamal joined him, hands stuffed in his pockets, a smirk on his face. "We did good, Noah." "Yeah, we did," Noah replied, his voice soft but full of conviction. The two friends stood together side by side as the sounds of laughter and conversation faded into the night. The stars above shone a little brighter, as if celebrating with them. Rosehill was far from perfect, but it was changing, and for the first time in a long while, the future felt full of promise. Noah turned to head home, Mabel's voice calling out to him from the path below. He lifted a hand in acknowledgement and started down the hill, his steps steady, his heart full. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. They would face them together, as a community that had learned to stand, fight, and grow together, and that he thought was worth everything. This chapter encapsulates the culmination of the community's efforts, portraying both the celebration of progress and the subtle, ongoing work of reconciliation and change. It highlights the power of collective action and forgiveness, setting the stage for a future that, while uncertain, is full of hope and possibility. Summer's end brought with it a golden hue that settled over Rosehill like a warm blanket. The town was buzzing with activity, from school children laughing on their way home to shopkeepers sweeping their stoops with a nod and a smile. Life felt different now, not in grand, sweeping changes, but in the smaller, subtler ways that spoke of a community finding its footing after being shaken to its core. Noah Carter sat on the steps of the community center, watching the world move around him. The building that had once been a neutral backdrop to town meetings had become a symbol of growth, filled with voices sharing stories, airing grievances, and planning futures. The overhead sign read, "Rosehill Community Oversight Board Headquarters," a testament to what they had accomplished. "Daydreaming, Carter?" Jamal's teasing voice cut through the warm afternoon, drawing Noah's attention. He turned to see his friend sauntering over, his grin as wide as ever. "Not exactly," Noah replied, smiling as Jamal took a seat next to him. Just reflecting, I guess. Jamal nodded, squinting at the horizon. You've earned that. But, no rest for the wicked. Ms. Clark's got another meeting lined up for tomorrow. Noah groaned good-naturedly. It was true that the work never really stopped. Every step forward came with new challenges, new conversations that needed to be had. But unlike before, when the weight had felt crushing, now it felt shared. "How's Eric?" Jamal asked after a moment, his voice lower. "He's working on it," Noah said, a thoughtful crease forming between his brows. "He's been showing up to every meeting, even spoke at the last one. People are starting to listen. People love a redemption story," Jamal said with a shrug. "But he's got a lot to make up for." Noah nodded, understanding the truth in Jamal's words. Eric Turner had spent months trying to navigate the line between his past beliefs and his present efforts. It hadn't been easy, and there were still those who looked at him with skepticism. But the important thing was that he kept coming back, showing that change wasn't just an event, it was a process. The next day, the meeting room at the community center was filled with the familiar faces of the oversight board and new ones from around the town. Mabel sat at the back, knitting needles clicking softly as she listened. The room hummed with energy as Mrs. Rosa Clark opened the meeting, her voice clear and confident. "We've made incredible progress," she began, eyes sweeping across the crowd. "But progress needs maintenance. It's not enough to set policies. We need to make sure they're followed, understood, and adapted when necessary." Noah listened intently as she spoke, jotting down notes and scanning the faces of the attendees. Some were deeply engaged, nodding as Ms. Clark outlined the next steps. Others, like Mr. Alvarez and Officer Daniels, wore thoughtful expressions. Then there were the faces of those who still harbored doubt, but even they were here, participating, which was more than could be said before. Eric Turner stood when Mrs. Clark invited input from the floor. The room quieted, the air tense as people leaned forward. His posture was a mix of confidence and nerves, hands clasped in front of him. "I know I've said this before," he began, eyes steady, but voice tinged with humility. "But I'll say it again because it's important. I was part of the problem. I resisted change because it felt like a threat to what I knew. But I've learned that holding on to the past doesn't protect us. It just keeps us stuck." A few nods followed his words, tentative but genuine. Noah caught Mabel's eye across the room, and she gave him a slight approving nod. Eric continued, "Moving forward, we need more than just policy. We need commitment, from all of us, to be better, do better." The applause started slow but grew as more hands joined in. Noah felt a rush of something. Relief, maybe, or the realization that trust, while difficult to rebuild, wasn't impossible. As the weeks turned into months, the Oversight Board's influence began to weave itself into the fabric of Rose Hill. Public forums became a staple of civic life, drawing residents who had once been strangers into discussions about safety, fairness, and the future they wanted for their children. New initiatives blossomed. Mentorship programs for young people, neighborhood watches run by community members, and workshops led by officers and residents together. One Saturday morning, Noah found himself in front of the high school gymnasium where a new community event was being held. A banner that read, "Bridging the Gap, a Day of Understanding," hung over the entrance. Inside, tables were set up with activities designed to foster connections between the police force and the community. Officer Daniels approached, a smile breaking across his usually serious face. "You ready for this?" he asked, a twinkle of amusement in his eyes. "As ready as I'll ever be," Noah replied, scanning the room filled with kids, parents, and officers talking and laughing together. The day was filled with activities, from trust-building exercises to open discussions moderated by Pastor Walker. Mabel had a table set up with her peach cobbler, serving slices and chatting with anyone who stopped by. Eric Turner manned a table where kids could ask questions about what police work really entailed. He wore a more relaxed look than Noah had seen in months, bending down to listen to a small boy who asked, wide-eyed, "Do you ever drive the cars really fast?" Eric chuckled, the sound genuine. "Only when it's absolutely necessary, kid." Noah watched the interaction from across the room, a smile spreading on his face. It wasn't perfect, and there was still work to be done, but it was real. It was progress. As the day drew to a close, Noah stood outside with Jamal, watching as people trickled out of the gymnasium, their faces bright with laughter and contentment. "That was good, wasn't it?" Jamal said, leaning against the brick wall and exhaling deeply. "Like really good." "Yeah, it was," Noah said, a note of wonder in his voice. The community had shown up, not just for the oversight board, but for each other. And that was the most important part. A familiar figure caught Noah's attention, Mrs. Clark, speaking with Chief Rollins. She looked over and nodded at Noah, a smile on her face that spoke volumes. It said, "Look how far we've come." As the last of the attendees drifted away, Noah turned to see Mabel waiting with a knowing look. She walked up to him, her hands on her hips in mock seriousness. "Well, young man, seems like you've become quite the fixture in this town." Noah laughed, the sound light and free. "Couldn't have done it without you, Gran." Mabel's eyes softened, and she reached up to pat his cheek. "You make me proud, Noah. You make this whole town proud." They stood together in the cool evening air, watching as the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting long shadows across the pavement. The streetlights flickered on, their glow gentle and steady. It was the kind of moment that felt timeless, like a promise whispered between generations. Over the next few weeks, the work continued, as it always did. New challenges arose, new voices spoke up, and the Oversight Board adapted, grew, and solidified its place in the town's governance. Noah found himself balancing the board's duties with the simple joys of life. Basketball games with Jamal, dinners with Mabel, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing people trust one another a little more each day. One evening, as he walked home, the air carrying the crispness of early fall, he spotted Eric Turner sitting on the steps of Sanders' Grocers, talking with Mr. Sanders. The older man's laughter rang out, surprising and genuine. Noah watched for a moment before continuing on, a smile playing at his lips. When he reached home, Mabel was waiting on the porch with 2 mugs of hot chocolate, steam curling into the night sky. "Thought you could use this," she said, handing him a mug. Noah sat beside her, taking a sip and letting the warmth seep through him. "Thanks, Gran." They sat in companionable silence, the kind that only comes from shared history and unspoken understanding. The street was quiet, the lights from neighboring windows casting a warm glow. The town felt different, but it also felt like home. A home that had faced its flaws and was learning to be better. "You know," Mabel said, breaking the silence, "change like this, it's not just roots, it's branches too. It spreads out, reaches further than we can see." Noah nodded, his eyes on the stars that twinkled overhead. "Yeah, Gran, I think you're right." As the night deepened and the last of the evening's sounds faded away, Rose Hill stood resilient, anchored by roots that ran deep and branches that reached for something more. And Noah knew that whatever came next, they were ready to meet it, together. This chapter brings the story to a point of reflective stability, highlighting the ongoing nature of community building and the shared effort required to maintain progress. It shows how even former adversaries can contribute to a better future, and underscores the power of collective action, resilience, and hope. Autumn settled into Rose Hill with a quiet grace, turning the leaves to gold and crimson, their crisp edges whispering secrets in the breeze. The town was alive with the sights and sounds of harvest time. Pumpkins on porches, children's laughter as they ran through the park, and the scent of spiced cider wafting from Sanders' Grocers, where Mr. Sanders had decided to embrace the season with gusto. Noah Carter stood in front of the community center, watching the sunlight filter through the amber leaves. The past year felt like a dream and a marathon all at once. He glanced down at the sheaf of papers in his hands, a proposal for a new youth program that would pair teens with community mentors. It was just one of the many projects that had emerged from the work of the Oversight Board. The idea was simple but powerful. Offer guidance, build trust, and keep the momentum of change moving forward. A familiar voice called out to him, breaking his reverie. Ms. Rosa Clark approached, a scarf wrapped around her neck against the chill. Her eyes sparkled as she waved a folder triumphantly. "I've just heard back from the city council," she said, her breath puffing in small clouds. "They've approved the pilot for the mentorship program. We're set to start next month." Noah's heart leapt, a smile breaking across his face. "That's incredible news, Mrs. Clark." "It's Rosa," she corrected, though the affection in her voice softened the reprimand. "And it's all thanks to you, Noah. You planted the seed, and now look at what's growing." Before Noah could respond, Jamal came jogging up the steps, a lopsided grin on his face. "Hey, you two," he said, nodding at them. "Did I hear something about the mentorship program?" "You did," Rosa confirmed, handing him a copy of the proposal. "We're official." Jamal scanned the first page, his eyes widening. "This is going to be great, Noah. Just think. Kids who might have felt like they had nowhere to go will finally have people looking out for them." Noah nodded, the reality of it settling deep in his chest. The board's work was no longer just about fixing what was broken. It was about creating something new, something better. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting the town in a warm golden glow, Noah and Jamal walked to Mabel's house, their breath visible in the cool air. They talked about their plans for the next board meeting, about who might volunteer to mentor, and which local businesses might help sponsor the program. "You ever think we'd be doing this?" Jamal asked, shoving his hands into his pockets to ward off the chill. "No," Noah admitted, a laugh escaping him. "But I can't imagine doing anything else now." They turned onto Noah's street, the soft glow of Mabel's porch light welcoming them home. She was sitting in her rocking chair, a blanket draped over her knees, her knitting needles clicking in the quiet. "Evening, boys," she called out as they approached. "You two look like you're plotting something." "Always, Gran," Noah said, grinning as he bent down to kiss her cheek. The warmth of her skin and the faint scent of lavender made him feel, as always, anchored. Jamal chuckled, leaning against the porch railing. "You know us too well, Mabel." "Well, come inside," she said, shifting her blanket. "I made stew, and it'll warm you right up." They followed her inside, the warmth and scent of spices wrapping around them like a hug. As they sat at the kitchen table, bowls of stew in front of them, Noah felt a wave of contentment. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time it felt manageable. The next morning brought a crisp wind that shook the leaves from the trees and sent them swirling down Main Street. Noah found himself back at the community center, helping set up for a workshop led by Officer Daniels and a group of residents who had agreed to work together on building safer, more cooperative neighborhoods. "Morning, Noah," Daniels said, rolling up the sleeves of his uniform as he carried a stack of chairs. He set them down with a thump and gave Noah a lopsided smile. "Ready for today?" "Always," Noah replied, passing him a clipboard with the agenda for the workshop. "Thanks for leading this, by the way." Daniels waved off the thanks. "It's what we need, and it's why I joined the board. Besides, it's good to see this place filled with people who care." The doors opened and residents began to filter in. Mr. Alvarez, who always had a word of encouragement. Tasha, who had turned into an outspoken advocate for youth involvement. And Mrs. Jenkins, who had come with a tin of cookies and a determined look on her face. The room buzzed with conversation as Daniels stepped up to the front. "All right, everyone," he said, clapping his hands to get their attention. "Let's talk about how we build trust, real trust, between the community and the police." The discussion that followed was candid and, at times, heated. People shared their fears, their frustrations, and their hopes. Daniels listened with a furrowed brow and nodded, taking notes and addressing questions with a level of sincerity that hadn't always been present in the town's dealings with authority. Trust isn't built overnight, he said toward the end of the workshop, looking directly at Noah. But if we keep showing up, if we keep having these conversations, we can get there. Noah felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Daniel's words echoed the unspoken promise that had carried him through the darkest nights. Change was slow, but it was real. That weekend, the mentorship program kicked off with a town event at the park. The air was cool but inviting, the sky a flawless blue dome overhead. Tents were set up, offering everything from arts and crafts to sports and story circles led by community elders. Mabel sat under one of the larger tents, sharing stories about the town's history with wide-eyed children. "And that's how Rosehill got its name," she finished, her voice warm and musical. Eric Turner stood nearby, directing a group of teens who were helping set up a soccer game. He caught Noah's eye and waved, a smile breaking across his face. "Hey, Carter," he called out, jogging over. "The kids are loving it. You should come join." Noah laughed, holding up his hands. "Not sure they want me tripping over the ball and embarrassing myself." "Hey, even heroes deserve a break," Eric said, clapping him on the shoulder. The gesture was friendly, genuine, and Noah felt a pang of surprise at how natural it felt. As the day unfolded, Noah watched the town move together, old divisions softening as laughter and conversation filled the park. Tasha ran a painting booth, her hands speckled with bright colors as she helped kids create their masterpieces. Jamal sat with some teens, joking and listening to their stories. Officer Daniels joined a game of tag, his laugh loud and carefree. Mabel caught Noah watching and walked over, the wind catching the edge of her scarf. "Proud of you, my boy," she said softly, eyes misty with emotion. "Look at what you've helped build." Noah felt a lump form in his throat, but it wasn't the heavy kind that came with sadness. This was different, full, rich, and warm. He looked around, taking in the park filled with the people he had grown up with, had fought alongside, and had learned to trust again. "I'm proud of us," he said, and Mabel squeezed his arm. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the park and turning the sky a dusky pink, the last of the laughter echoed into the cooling air. Families packed up their things, waving as they left. Noah stood at the edge of the park, the sounds of the evening, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, wrapping around him like a familiar song. Eric approached, hands in his pockets, and a smile that was smaller but no less sincere. "Today was good, wasn't it?" "Yeah, it was," Noah said, his voice quiet. He glanced at Eric, who stared out at the park, his expression thoughtful. "I've been meaning to say thank you," Eric said, looking at Noah, "for giving me a chance to be part of this. I didn't think I deserved it." Noah met his gaze, the old animosities now replaced with understanding. "We all needed a chance to do better," he said. "And you took it." The two stood in silence as the last light of day slipped behind the horizon, leaving the park in a soft, shadowed glow. Later, as Noah walked home under the blanket of stars, he felt the cool air on his face, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. The street was quiet, the lights from houses casting warm pools of light that made the shadows less daunting. When he reached his house, Mabel was waiting on the porch, a mug of tea in her hands. She smiled as he climbed the steps, the creak of the wood familiar and comforting. "Ready for a break?" she asked, her eyes twinkling. Noah sat beside her, leaning back and looking up at the stars. For a little while, yeah. They sat in silence, the kind that spoke of years spent together, of shared trials and triumphs. The town of Rosehill was not perfect. No town ever would be. But it was moving forward. Roots had deepened, branches had spread, and under the night sky, Noah felt a peace he hadn't known before. Rosehill's journey was far from over, but it was no longer a story of fractures and division. It was one of growth, of hope, and of the endless, beautiful work of being a community. And Noah, with Mabel by his side, was ready for whatever came next. This chapter encapsulates the establishment of enduring community bonds and the continuation of collaborative progress. It illustrates the long-term effects of reconciliation and trust building, emphasizing that the journey toward a better community is ongoing and sustained by collective effort and resilience. The chill of late autumn had settled into Rose Hill, painting the town in hues of deep orange, maroon, and gold. The days were shorter now, and the nights crept in sooner, bringing with them the scent of wood smoke and the first whispers of frost. The town's heartbeat felt steady, yet eager, as if it too sensed the turning of a chapter, the anticipation of what lay ahead. Noah Carter woke to the sound of leaves skittering across the pavement, carried by a brisk wind that rattled the windows of his bedroom. He sat up, the familiar creak of the old wooden floorboards beneath his feet, grounding him as he moved to the window. The street outside was bathed in the soft morning light, and a few early risers were already out, their breath visible in the cold air. "Today's the day," he muttered to himself, a mix of excitement and nerves fluttering in his chest. The Community Oversight Board was hosting a town-wide meeting that evening to share the findings of the past year's audit and outline plans for the future. It would be the first time that all the board's work, countless hours of reviewing cases, hosting forums, and proposing new protocols would be presented in full. The stakes felt high, but for the first time, the feeling wasn't daunting. It was invigorating. Downstairs, Mabel was already up, the scent of her fresh cinnamon rolls filling the kitchen. She glanced up from the stove as Noah entered, her eyes warm and knowing. "Nervous, aren't you?" she asked with a smile, pouring him a cup of coffee. "Maybe a little," Noah admitted, taking the mug and wrapping his hands around it. The warmth seeped into his palms, calming him. "It's just, tonight's important." "It is," Mabel agreed, setting a plate of rolls on the table and sitting across from him. "But you've done the work. You've brought people together, Noah. Whatever happens tonight, you should be proud." Noah nodded, the tension in his chest loosening. "Thanks, Gran." She reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "Now eat up. You're going to need your strength." By mid-afternoon, the community center was a hive of activity. Volunteers set up rows of chairs, adjusted the microphone, and laid out refreshments along the back wall. Ms. Rosa Clark moved through the room with her usual purposeful stride, clipboard in hand and eyes scanning every detail. "Noah!" she called out when she spotted him, a smile breaking across her face. "Everything's nearly ready. How are you holding up?" "Good," Noah said, exhaling as he took in the busy scene. "Ready as I'll ever be." "Good. We've got a full house expected," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "This isn't just a meeting. It's a milestone." The door opened behind them, and Officer Daniels walked in, followed closely by Pastor Walker, who gave Noah a nod of encouragement. Daniels wore a simple button-up shirt, his badge absent for the evening, as he wanted to be seen as part of the community, not just an officer. The hours ticked by, and soon the room was full. The hum of conversation swirled around Noah as he stood near the front, the anticipation building. Mabel sat in the front row, hands clasped and eyes filled with pride. Jamal was next to her, fidgeting with a pen, but grinning when he caught Noah's eye. "Ms." Clark stepped to the microphone, the room gradually quieting as she raised her hand. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice strong and clear. "Thank you all for being here. Tonight, we stand at a turning point for Rose Hill. Over the past year, we've faced hard truths, but we've also shown what we're capable of when we come together." Applause rippled through the room, heartfelt and earnest. "Our goal tonight is to share the findings of the audit, outline the changes that have already been made, and discuss what comes next," she continued, nodding toward Noah, who stepped up to the mic. He glanced at the crowd, a sea of familiar and new faces, Mr. Sanders, who gave a supportive nod, Tasha, with a look of determination, even Eric Turner standing at the back, arms crossed, but eyes attentive. "When we started this journey, it was about more than just addressing what happened to me," Noah began, his voice steady. It was about making sure that everyone in this town, no matter who they are, feels seen, heard, and protected. He spoke about the audit, highlighting the changes that had been implemented, clearer guidelines for police interactions, the establishment of the Oversight Board as a permanent fixture, and the new mentorship program that had already begun to see success. He shared stories of teens who had found direction through the program, of neighbors who had learned to trust each other again. Change isn't just about policies, Noah said, catching Mabel's eye. It's about people. And what we've learned is that when people come together, change becomes not only possible, but inevitable. The room erupted in applause, and Noah stepped back, his heart hammering but light. After the formal part of the evening concluded, the crowd broke into smaller groups, mingling and talking. The room was alive with laughter, conversation, and the clinking of coffee cups. Eric Turner approached, a hesitant smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Hey, Noah," he said, voice low but sincere. "You did good up there." "Thanks, Eric," Noah said, offering a hand. Eric took it, their handshake firm and filled with an unspoken understanding. "Feels like the town's turning a corner," Eric added, glancing around at the lively room. "It is," Noah agreed, "and we need everyone on board to keep it going." Eric nodded, the hint of a grin finally breaking through. "Count me in." Jamal appeared next to Noah, draping an arm over his shoulder. "Look at this," he said, gesturing at the room. "We did it, man." "Not just us," Noah said, smiling as he looked at Mrs. Clark laughing with Mrs. Jenkins, at Officer Daniels deep in conversation with Mr. Alvarez, and at Mabel watching it all with the serene smile of someone who had seen enough to know what true progress looked like. As the crowd began to thin and the evening grew quieter, Noah found himself back on the steps of the community center. The cold air biting but refreshing. He watched his breath cloud in front of him, the noise from inside dimming as people said their goodbyes and headed home. Mabel came out, her coat pulled tight around her, and joined him on the steps. For a while they sat in silence, listening to the rustle of leaves and the distant sounds of life winding down for the night. "It's a good night, isn't it?" she said, her voice breaking the silence. "It is," Noah replied, looking out at the street lamps casting their soft golden glow over the sidewalks. The town felt different now. Not perfect, but better. "I think your mother would be proud," Mabel said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Proud of the man you've become, of the way you've taken care of this town." Noah swallowed hard, the lump in his throat almost too much to speak around. "I hope so," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Mabel reached over, her hand warm and reassuring. "I know so." As they sat there side by side, the wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of winter, but also the resilience of a town that had faced its fears and found a way to grow through them. The future was unwritten, full of new challenges and opportunities. But whatever came next, Noah was ready to face it, knowing that he wouldn't have to do it alone. He had his friends, his family, and the people of Rose Hill, a town that had learned to listen, to change, and to care. And for now, that was enough. This chapter underscores the culmination of hard-earned progress and unity within the community. It illustrates the ways in which relationships have evolved, highlighting the ongoing journey of growth and cooperation. It ends on a hopeful note, emphasizing the shared commitment to maintaining change and facing the future together. Winter arrived in Rose Hill like an old friend, with frosty mornings and the soft hush of snow falling in the early hours. The streets transformed under a blanket of white, and the town seemed quieter, as if holding its breath. The changes set in motion over the past year had started to take root, but winter was a time for reflection and resilience, a season to see if new growth could survive the cold. Noah Carter sat at the kitchen table staring at the snowflakes spiraling lazily past the window. The familiar warmth of Mabel's house surrounded him, the scent of cinnamon from her baking, the creak of the floorboards under her slippers as she moved about. It was peaceful, Yet his mind buzzed with the weight of the meeting scheduled for that afternoon. It was the last town forum before the new year, a chance to solidify the work they had done and map out the coming months. "You're deep in thought again," Mabel said, setting a steaming mug of cocoa in front of him. Her smile was gentle, her eyes knowing. "Just thinking about today," Noah said, wrapping his hands around the mug and feeling its warmth seep into him. "I want people to see that what we're doing matters, even now." Mabel nodded, her expression serious. "Change takes time, but it needs nurturing, especially when things get cold." She sat across from him, her own mug cradled in her hands. "Remember, Noah, you're not alone in this. You never have been." Noah smiled, the tension in his chest loosening. "Thanks, Gran." The community center was bustling by the time Noah arrived. Snow clung to the shoulders of his coat as he shook it off and stepped inside, greeted by the murmur of voices and the smell of fresh coffee. Ms. Rosa Clark stood near the front, clipboard in hand, talking with Pastor Walker and Officer Daniels. A group of teens from the mentorship program were setting up chairs, their laughter adding a lightness to the atmosphere. Jamal appeared beside Noah, stamping snow off his boots and grinning. "Ready for another round of speeches and serious faces?" he joked, nudging Noah with his elbow. "Always," Noah said, his own smile growing. The playful banter was a reminder that they weren't just surviving this process. They were living it, building it together. "Let's make this a good one," Jamal said, and they moved into the hall to help where they could. As the meeting began, the room quieted. The turnout was impressive, with people filling the seats and standing along the walls. The room glowed with the light of hanging lanterns and the warmth of shared purpose. Mabel sat in her usual front row seat, wrapped in a thick knit scarf, eyes sparkling as she watched Noah take his place on stage. Ms. Clark opened the meeting with her customary poise, detailing the successes and ongoing projects of the Oversight Board. She spoke of the mentorship program's impact, the training workshops that had become regular fixtures, and the way community trust was being rebuilt piece by piece. When she finished, she stepped aside, giving Noah a nod. "Thank you, Miss Clark," Noah said, stepping up to the microphone. He took a breath, letting the silence settle before he spoke. "This past year has taught us a lot. We've seen how difficult it is to face what's uncomfortable and to commit to changing it. But we've also seen the strength that comes when we do." He looked out at the crowd, at familiar faces that had become partners in this journey. Mr. Sanders, Tasha, Mrs. Jenkins, even Eric Turner, who stood near the back with a group of townspeople who had once been skeptical but now listened intently. "What we've accomplished is only the beginning," Noah continued. "Real change is more than 1 year, more than one season. It's what we do when things get hard, when progress feels slow. And it's how we support each other during those times." A ripple of agreement moved through the room, and Noah felt the warmth of Mabel's gaze, steady and proud. He finished his speech with a smile, stepping back as applause broke out, filling the space with a sense of unity that no storm could chill. The rest of the evening was filled with conversations that felt less formal and more like friends catching up. People clustered around tables, exchanging ideas and sharing stories. Officer Daniels found Noah near the coffee table, holding a paper cup that steamed in the cold air. "Good speech," Daniels said, his grin wide. "You make it easy for people to feel hopeful." "Thanks, Daniels," Noah said. "But it's not just me, it's all of us." Daniels nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "Still, it helps to have someone reminding us why we're doing this. Don't underestimate that." Nearby, Jamal was leading a group of teenagers in a loud, animated discussion about organizing a winter charity drive. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and Noah felt a surge of pride. The mentorship program had become more than just guidance. It was a source of inspiration for the whole town. Eric Turner approached, his expression more open than it had ever been. "Hey, Noah," he said, the hint of a smile breaking through. "Mind if I steal a moment?" "Of course," Noah said, stepping aside with him. Eric shifted, running a hand over the back of his neck. I wanted to say thanks for today, and for, well, everything. It's hard for some folks to let go of old ways, you know? But seeing this, being part of it, makes me think it's possible. Noah met his eyes, understanding the weight behind Eric's words. It is possible. It just takes time. A brief silence passed, comfortable and contemplative. Eric nodded once, more to himself than anyone, and clapped Noah on the shoulder before walking back to join a conversation at another table. By the time the meeting wrapped up, snow had started to fall again, dusting the streets in a fresh layer of white. People left the community center in pairs and groups, their voices carrying warmth into the winter night. Noah lingered, standing on the steps with Jamal and Mabel, who had wrapped herself tighter in her scarf. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Mabel said, watching the snow drift lazily down. "It is," Noah agreed, looking around. The town felt different in the quiet, with the snow softening the edges of everything. But it was more than the landscape. It was the sense that they had come through the hardest part together and were still moving forward. Jamal stretched, letting out a sigh that puffed white in the air. "Looks like it's going to be a long winter." "Yeah," Noah said, a smile playing on his lips. "But we've handled worse." They stood together for a moment longer, letting the silence settle before heading home. The street lamps glowed, casting soft circles of light that shimmered against the snow. Each step felt solid, steady, as if the ground beneath their feet was no longer uncertain, but sure and welcoming. That night, as Noah sat by the window in his room, watching the snow fall in thick, lazy flakes, he felt a deep, abiding sense of peace. The town of Rose Hill was not perfect, but it was resilient. It had faced its fears and found the strength to change. And as the seasons turned, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it as they always had, together. With a final glance at the sleeping town, he pulled his blanket tighter around him and let the quiet of the night cradle him into sleep, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. This chapter reflects on the end of a year of progress and the community's preparation for what lies ahead. It showcases the resilience and solidarity built over time, emphasizing the importance of sustained effort and mutual support as Rose Hill continues to grow and adapt. Winter loosened its icy grip on Rose Hill, and the days grew longer as the first signs of spring appeared. The snow melted into rivulets that whispered down the streets, and green shoots dared to push through the thawing ground. The town had endured the cold with resilience, holding on to the warmth that came from shared purpose. Now, the promise of renewal beckoned. Noah Carter stood in front of Sanders Grocers, a flyer in hand advertising the upcoming Community Spring Festival. It was the first event of its kind since the Oversight Board's formation, intended to celebrate the progress made and to signal that Rose Hill was ready to look forward. Mr. Sanders stepped out, the bell above the door jingling. He squinted against the sunlight, his lined face breaking into a smile as he saw Noah. "Looks like we'll be busy this weekend," he said, gesturing to the flyer. "Yeah, it's going to be good for the town," Noah replied, folding the flyer and tucking it into his pocket. The event was planned for Saturday, with booths, music, food, and speeches. It was meant to remind everyone that growth wasn't just about fixing the past, but celebrating the future. Mr. Sanders nodded, leaning on his broom. "You know, I don't think I've seen this much excitement since the Centennial Parade." "You've done well, Noah. Your folks would be proud." Noah felt a familiar ache at the mention of his parents, but it was softened by the pride that followed. "Thanks, Mr. Sanders." The shopkeeper's eyes were kind, and he reached out to pat Noah on the shoulder. "Keep it up, son. This town's lucky to have you." The day of the festival dawned bright and clear, the sky a wide expanse of blue that promised warmth and laughter. Tents and booths popped up around the town square, their colorful awnings fluttering in the breeze. Tables were loaded with baked goods, handmade crafts, and jars of preserves that gleamed in the sunlight. Children darted between the booths, their giggles punctuating the chatter of adults. Noah walked through the square, the energy lifting his spirits. He caught sight of Jamal near a booth advertising the mentorship program, chatting animatedly with a group of teens. Nearby, Mrs. Rosa Clark was helping set up a stage for the afternoon speeches. She saw Noah and waved him over. "We're just about ready," she said, wiping her hands on her skirt. "How are you feeling?" "Excited," Noah admitted, glancing around. The air buzzed with a sense of possibility. "It feels like a new beginning." "Ms.?" Clark's face softened. "It is. And it's proof that we can build something lasting if we're willing to do the work." Before Noah could respond, a voice called out from behind. Eric Turner approached, hands in his pockets and a smile that had grown more confident over the past months. "Hey Noah, Mrs. Clark," he said, nodding to each of them. "Looks like the whole town turned out." "Just about," Noah said, clapping Eric on the back. Their relationship had transformed from one of wary distance to mutual respect, a testament to the changes that were now part of the fabric of Rose Hill. Eric gestured toward the stage. "You ready for your big speech?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Noah said, his smile widening. The festival hit its stride as the afternoon sun warmed the square. Mabel presided over a booth of baked goods, her peach cobbler a runaway favorite. The sounds of a local band strummed through the air, a mix of folk and blues that kept feet tapping and heads nodding. Neighbors who had once passed each other in silence now chatted easily, their laughter blending with the music. When it was time for the speeches, the crowd gathered near the stage, their faces bright with anticipation. Pastor Walker took the microphone first, his voice deep and resonant as he spoke about the journey Rose Hill had taken. "Today, we celebrate more than just a season," he said, eyes sweeping the crowd. "We celebrate the strength it takes to grow, the courage it takes to change, and the hope that carries us forward." Applause rang out, and Noah felt a swell of emotion as he stepped up to the mic next. He looked out at the crowd, at Mabel's proud smile, at Jamal's thumbs up, at Mrs. Clark standing with her arms crossed but eyes gleaming with approval. "Rose Hill has always been my home," Noah began, his voice steady. "But this past year, it's felt more like a community than ever before. We faced difficult truths and made changes, not just in policy, but in how we see and treat one another." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Today isn't just about looking back. It's about looking ahead. It's about understanding that change is something we build together, every day. It's in how we show up for each other, in the stories we share, in the ways we listen and learn." The applause this time was louder, a unified expression of the journey they'd taken together. Noah stepped back, his heart thudding with pride and gratitude. He caught Eric's eye in the crowd and saw him nod, a silent acknowledgement that they were all part of this story. As the sun began to set, casting the square in a warm amber glow, the festival continued. The band played a slow, soulful tune, and couples began to dance. Mabel found Noah by the drinks table, her cheeks flushed with the joy of the day. "Look at this," she said, gesturing at the square. "It's like the whole town's come alive." "It has," Noah agreed, watching as children ran through the twilight, their laughter ringing out like bells. The night was filled with the hum of conversation and the gentle clinking of glasses. Eric joined them, holding 2 cups of cider. He handed one to Mabel, who accepted it with a smile. "This has been a day to remember," he said, looking at Noah. "I didn't think we'd ever see something like this." "Me neither," Noah admitted. "But here we are." They stood together in companionable silence, watching as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The sounds of the festival faded slightly, replaced by the quiet murmurs of people gathering their things, lingering for a few last moments before heading home. The following week, the town settled back into its routine, but the memory of the festival lingered. The Oversight Board resumed its work, buoyed by the renewed sense of unity. Initiatives that had once seemed daunting were now met with enthusiasm, as the festival had reminded everyone why they were working so hard. One afternoon, Noah sat at the community center, poring over plans for the mentorship program's expansion. The door opened, and Mabel walked in, carrying a basket of lunch for him. "You've been at this all day," she said, setting the basket down and pulling out sandwiches. "You need a break." "Just a little longer, Gran," Noah said, smiling as she rolled her eyes. "Noah, even a change-maker needs to eat," she said, sitting down beside him. "This town is moving forward thanks to you, but don't forget to take care of yourself, too." He laughed, taking the sandwich she offered. "Yes, ma'am." They ate in comfortable silence, the sounds of the town outside filtering through the open window. The air was warmer now, hinting at the summer to come. Noah looked at Mabel, at her steady, loving presence, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. "Gran," he said after a moment, "do you think this is just the beginning?" She looked at him, eyes twinkling. "I think the beginning was long ago, when you decided to stand up for what's right. This is the middle of a beautiful story, and there's a lot more to come." Noah nodded, the promise of her words filling him with resolve. The road ahead would have its challenges, but it would also have days like the festival. Moments that reminded him why he and everyone else kept moving forward. Rose Hill was still learning, still growing, but it was ready for whatever came next. And so was he. This chapter celebrates the continued progress of Rose Hill, marked by a festival that symbolizes renewal and collective hope. It reinforces the idea that real change is a process, built not just by leaders, but by the entire community coming together. The story concludes with a sense of optimism, showing that the journey continues with resilience and unity. Spring unfurled its colors across Rose Hill with an enthusiasm that was almost palpable. Blossoms dotted the trees, their pink and white petals falling like confetti when the breeze swept through the town. The air smelled fresh, carrying with it the earthy promise of rain and renewal. It felt like a fitting backdrop for what Noah Carter knew would be a day of new beginnings. The Oversight Board was hosting a final spring meeting, meant to conclude the season's work and lay the foundation for the summer ahead. It wasn't just about the policies or the projects anymore. It was about deepening the bonds that had formed over the past year and ensuring the community's future was one built on trust, resilience, and shared hope. Mabel fussed over Noah's tie, straightening it even though he was convinced it was already perfect. "You've got to look your best today," she said. "Gran, it's just another meeting," Noah said, but the warmth in her gaze told him she knew it was more than that. This was a moment that marked not just the culmination of a year's work, but the solidifying of a new way forward for the town. "Not just any meeting," she said, patting his shoulder. "This one's the start of something big, and you know it." He smiled, a mix of nerves and excitement bubbling up. "Thanks, Gran." She waved him off with a grin. "Now go on. I'll be right behind you." The community center was filled to the brim with townspeople. The air hummed with conversation, and the windows were open to let in the soft, fragrant breeze. Noah stood at the front with Mrs. Rosa Clark and Pastor Walker, both of whom had become as essential to him as family. Jamal, ever the jokester, was at the back chatting with teens from the mentorship program, and even Eric Turner was there, leaning against the wall with an easy smile. As Ms. Clark stepped up to open the meeting, the room quieted. "We gather here today not just to look back at what we've accomplished, but to lay the foundation for what comes next," she said, her voice confident and kind. "This isn't the end of our work. It's a new chapter." The crowd applauded, and Noah felt the room's energy pulse around him, a shared heartbeat. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped forward and scanned the room, taking in the faces of friends, neighbors, and those who had once been strangers. "We've learned that change is more than a decision. It's a commitment," he began. "It's in the small daily choices we make to be kinder, to listen better, to show up for one another. This year, we've proven that we can do that. But the real test is to keep going, to make it part of who we are." Mabel's proud eyes met his, and he felt the strength of generations behind him. Today, Noah continued, we're starting new initiatives, expanding the mentorship program, continuing the forums, and making sure the oversight board remains a voice for everyone. But more than that, we're making a promise that Rose Hill will be a place where everyone belongs. The applause was thunderous, and for a moment, Noah felt the familiar lump in his throat. Not from fear or doubt, but from the overwhelming realization that they were indeed moving forward together. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of conversations and handshakes. When it was over, people lingered, unwilling to break the spell of shared optimism. Mabel caught Noah in a hug so tight he laughed, the sound light and free. "I knew you could do it," she whispered. "You've given this town a new heart." "No, Gran," he said, eyes crinkling with a smile. "We all did." Eric approached with Jamal in tow, both of them laughing about something that had the teens nearby rolling their eyes. "Noah, that was a speech for the ages," Eric said, holding out his hand. "Thanks, Eric," Noah said, shaking it firmly. The camaraderie between them felt earned, a testament to how far they'd come. "All right, what's next?" Jamal asked, clapping Noah on the back. "Because I'm not done yet." "Neither am I," Noah said, looking out at the people mingling around them, their faces alight with hope. "We keep building." The sun was setting as Noah walked Mabel home, the sky a masterpiece of orange, pink, and deepening blue. The air was warm, carrying the scent of blossoms and fresh grass. They walked in comfortable silence, their steps unhurried. When they reached the front porch, Mabel sat in her rocking chair, and Noah took the one beside her. The world felt quiet, save for the soft rustle of leaves and the faint chirping of crickets. "Do you think it'll last?" Noah asked, breaking the silence. He wasn't just talking about the changes or the oversight board, but the feeling that had taken root in the town. The belief that they could be better. Mabel looked at him, her eyes wise and full of certainty. "As long as there are people like you, Noah, it will. Because change isn't just one big moment. It's what we choose to do with each day." He nodded, the answer settling in him like an anchor. He watched as the first stars appeared, their light steady and unfaltering, and he felt that same steadiness within himself. Whatever came next, Rose Hill was ready. They were ready. And so, under the vast sky, the town of Rose Hill, strengthened by its trials and warmed by its shared hope, looked toward a future that was no longer a question, but a promise. A promise of resilience, community, and the unending journey of becoming more together than they could ever be apart. For Noah Carter, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.